Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little sensitive. You probably won't survive this. I'm talking about what medieval women were taught about sex, a topic that could easily make you squirm or laugh awkwardly. But hey, this was real history, and it's actually kind of fascinating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and the time in the comments below. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. All right, picture this. Medieval Europe, somewhere around the 12th century. You're a young woman, probably living in a small village, maybe a bustling city or in the more elite circles of a noble family. You might have heard whispers about sex, most likely the sort of whispers that hint at it being a bit taboo, but ultimately essential for producing heirs and continuing the family line. The concept of sex, though, wasn't just about pleasure or intimacy. It was all tied up in something bigger: religion, status, and survival. You were taught what your society expected of you, mostly through your mother, your priest, or if you were lucky enough, some well-meaning but very awkward conversations from family members. But here's the thing. What you were taught wasn't what you'd expect if you're picturing modern-day sex education. In fact, medieval women didn't exactly get a lesson in anatomy or consent. And pleasure. Well, that was more or less brushed under the rug. Instead, sex was seen as a tool, something that could get you into trouble if misused, something tied to duty, and yes, something that often involved a lot of confusion, shame, and societal pressure. At its core, sex was understood to have one very specific purpose: procreation. If you were lucky enough to live in the wealthier circles, you'd be married off for alliances, and your main job once wed would be to have children, preferably male ones, so the family could continue its name and lands. No pressure, right? But this belief, of course, meant that women's bodies were often reduced to mere vessels for childbearing, and anything beyond that was considered suspect, if not outright sinful. So, let's get into it. How were medieval women taught about sex? First off, sex was primarily a concept tied to sin and religious morality. The church, which controlled almost every aspect of life, especially in the early medieval period, had a very clear stance. Sex outside of marriage was evil. But even within marriage, things weren't that simple. The church taught that the purpose of sex was not just to create life, but also to avoid lust and avoid it at all costs. For women, this was complicated because the idea that sexual pleasure could be enjoyed or even acceptable was well complicated. Pleasure was a byproduct of sex, yes, but not something to be sought out. In fact, if you enjoyed it, that could be seen as a sign that you were indulging in sin. Imagine trying to wrap your head around that. Sex is for procreation, but you're told to keep your desires under control, even though you've been married and are now expected to make babies. You can see how a lot of confusion could arise from these teachings, right? In fact, much of the education surrounding sex was based on shame. If a woman showed any form of sexual desire outside the confines of marriage, she was often labeled as immoral. But if she desired too much pleasure within the confines of marriage, that was a whole different set of problems. This leads us to one of the most important and perhaps strangest aspects of medieval sex education: virginity. There was immense pressure on women to remain virgins until marriage. Virginity was not just a physical state. It was a social and religious marker. The ideal woman was a virgin before marriage and a faithful wife after. The entire concept of chastity was wrapped in religious symbolism, with the Virgin Mary herself held up as the ultimate model of purity. Losing virginity then wasn't just a biological experience. It was a moral event that could make or break a woman's reputation and worth in the eyes of society. The Church's obsession with virginity was grounded in their beliefs that sexual purity was a reflection of a woman's spiritual purity. Even in marriage, women were expected to maintain a certain level of chastity, meaning their sexual role was less about pleasure and more about performing their wifely duties. Imagine being told that the highest ideal you could achieve was to be a pure vessel entirely defined by your ability to not give in to sinful desires. And let's not forget about the lack of accurate sexual knowledge. There wasn't much in the way of practical education about the human body or how to manage sex outside of the occasional tip passed down from women who had gone through it before. Many women learned about the realities of their bodies by trial and error, sometimes through awkward or harmful experiences, especially for those in less privileged positions. Women in the lower classes were often expected to just get on with it and make babies, whether they had any idea of what was going on or not. Let's get deeper into how these lessons played out in the real lives of women. Remember, society didn't just hand out brochures on how sex worked, let alone how it felt. Women learned about sex primarily through their families, specifically their mothers. However, these lessons weren't exactly comprehensive or pleasant. In fact, a lot of the information passed down was often more about how to avoid temptation or about the religious implications of sex, rather than offering practical knowledge about anatomy or, heaven forbid, pleasure. In wealthier families, things were a bit different, at least in theory. Noble women had the luxury of more formal education and access to religious instruction. But even then, their lessons didn't touch much on what sex might be like in real life. Instead, the focus was usually on how to behave in marriage and how to produce heirs. Noble women were expected to bear children and provide a stable, healthy family life for their husbands and estates. Marriage wasn't about romantic love or even mutual companionship. It was a strategic alliance. And once married, your primary job was to ensure that there were heirs to secure the family name and fortune. No pressure there. For women in the lower classes, however, things were even murkier. Their understanding of sex likely came from word of mouth, and the teachings, if they even existed, were more likely to focus on managing pregnancies and dealing with the logistics of child rearing. Even in peasant communities, a woman's main role was still to bear children and work alongside her husband in farming or other physical labor. While there were some instances of midwives or older women offering guidance, this was rarely formal, and it often consisted more of practical advice on how to deal with the consequences of sex, like pregnancy, rather than any sort of real education about the act itself. The issue of pleasure in sex, well, that was mostly ignored or flat-out repressed. For medieval women, pleasure was often viewed as suspect. After all, if the primary purpose of sex was reproduction, why would women be encouraged to enjoy it? There's actually a prevailing belief that any form of sexual pleasure could be sinful. For example, some theologians of the time argued that even the slightest amount of enjoyment during sex, especially for women, was a form of indulgence bordering on moral failure. This belief was in part because pleasure was often linked to the idea of lust, and lust was seen as a dangerous force that could lead to sin. For women, particularly any sign of desire, was treated as an invitation to temptation, something that could upset the natural order of marriage and family. This attitude toward pleasure also influenced the medical views of the time. Medieval medicine, which was rooted in both classical Greek and Roman teachings and Christian theology, often viewed the female body as a mysterious and inherently sinful thing. The notion of the wandering womb, for instance, was a popular medical theory where the womb was believed to move around inside the body, causing all sorts of health issues and emotional disturbances. In this context, women's sexuality was largely seen as a force that needed to be controlled. Medical treatments often revolved around the idea of balancing humors and ensuring that women didn't overindulge in sex or let their emotions get the best of them. For example, any emotional upset or behavior that was out of the ordinary could be classified as hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for everything from anxiety to excessive desire, often blamed on a woman's sexual energy. As strange as this may sound today, these medieval beliefs had real consequences. Women's bodies were often seen as vessels of disorder, and their sexuality was treated as something that needed to be managed carefully to prevent chaos. In fact, many medieval texts, whether medical or religious, offered advice on how women could avoid becoming too sexual or too emotional. These texts emphasized that the ideal woman was one who was calm, subdued, and entirely focused on her role as a wife and mother. The idea of a woman enjoying sex for pleasure outside of its reproductive function was virtually non-existent in mainstream thought. But there were some outliers. You see, while the church and medical practitioners worked hard to shape how women understood their own bodies and sexuality, there was still some space for alternative views and practices. For example, midwives, who played a central role in childbirth and women's health, often had a more practical, less shame-based approach to sex. They were among the few who could offer direct advice to women about their sexual health and well-being. And because midwives were typically women themselves, they sometimes had more empathy and understanding of the female body than male medical practitioners. Midwives were also a source of information about birth control, though this was often a topic clouded in secrecy. Some women would have turned to herbal remedies or other folk practices to manage their reproductive health. However, most of these methods were unreliable at best and sometimes dangerous. Yet it was a way for women to try and gain a measure of control over their bodies in a society where they had so little autonomy. While women might not have been taught about pleasure or sexual rights in formal terms, there were moments in history when some women might have been able to assert a small degree of control over their sexual lives. For instance, there are examples in literature and even in real life of women who are able to negotiate sexual relations with their husbands. Of course, this was a rare exception and not the norm. But it does highlight that even at a time of strict societal rules and heavy religious influence, some women still managed to carve out a small space for themselves when it came to their bodies and sexuality. In the grand scheme of things, though, the story of medieval women's sexual education is one of repression, confusion, and minimal control. In a world where virginity was prized above all else, and pleasure was something to be feared, women had little room to explore their own desires or even understand their own bodies. Their lessons about sex were often based more on shame and silence than on open discussion or practical knowledge. As we've already seen, medieval women's understanding of sex was largely shaped by the strict teachings of the Catholic Church, a rigid societal structure, and for many, a lack of formal education. However, let's not forget that these women weren't passive recipients of this information. In fact, their experiences, though often restricted and controlled, were varied, and sometimes they found ways to assert some degree of autonomy, even within such a constrictive framework. One key aspect of medieval sexual education, or lack thereof, was the view of marriage itself. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't about romantic love. It was a contract and a social duty. For women, the primary purpose of marriage was to produce legitimate heirs. And for men, marriage served as a way to expand wealth, land, and influence. In this context, women were taught from a young age that their primary duty once married was to provide children, preferably male children, to secure the family name. While sex was an essential part of this process, it was often approached with a sense of duty rather than passion. In fact, it wasn't unusual for marriages to be arranged with little to no regard for the bride's desires or personal feelings. This dynamic ensured that the wife's role was clearly defined. She was to be a vessel for the next generation. The emphasis on childbearing was also connected to ideas about women's bodies. The medieval medical understanding of the female reproductive system was based on ancient Greek and Roman theories, which were then heavily influenced by Christian ideas of purity and sin. Women's bodies were often seen as imperfect or defective in comparison to men's, and their reproductive organs were viewed as both mysterious and prone to disorder. There was a prevailing belief in something called the wandering womb. The idea that a woman's womb could move around her body, causing all sorts of health problems and emotional instability. This belief had profound implications for how women were taught to understand their sexuality. For many women, the connection between their bodies and their sexuality was distorted, making it difficult to feel any sense of control or agency over their own reproductive health. Even the act of childbirth, which was closely tied to sex, was something that women had little control over. Giving birth was a dangerous endeavor, with maternal mortality rates being high, especially among women in lower social classes. Most women had little in the way of medical support during childbirth, relying instead on midwives and the occasional prayers of local priests. While midwives were often the most knowledgeable when it came to female reproductive health, they still had little access to the kind of formal medical training that might have helped them offer more reliable advice about sex and childbirth. Consequently, for many women, sex and childbirth were both shrouded in fear and mystery, two events that could either fulfill their role as mothers and wives or result in pain, suffering, and sometimes even death. For women who didn't fit the traditional mold of marriage and motherhood, life could be even more difficult. Nuns, for example, were expected to live completely celibate lives, avoiding not just sexual intercourse, but even the temptation of any desire or emotional attachment. For these women, the path to spiritual purity was an ongoing struggle against the temptations of the flesh. The teachings of the Church insisted that women should focus on their spiritual growth rather than their bodily desires. It wasn't uncommon for women to be warned that any indulgence in the pleasures of the flesh could lead to damnation. This meant that nuns and other religious women were often taught to suppress their sexual urges entirely, which could cause psychological and emotional strain, especially considering the inherent human need for connection. Meanwhile, outside of religious life, there were other ways in which medieval women could attempt to assert some form of agency over their sexuality, albeit in subtle and sometimes covert ways. One of these was through the power of sexuality itself. Specifically, the use of sexual charm and allure to secure positions of influence or control. For women in the upper classes, the ability to be a charming wife or a seductive mistress was often seen as a form of soft power. This dynamic is especially evident in courtly love literature, where women were often depicted as powerful figures who could both inspire and control men through their beauty and sexual allure. Though these stories were often idealized and not necessarily reflective of real life, they offered a glimpse into a different side of female sexuality, one where women could at least in some instances exercise a degree of control over their sexual lives. However, for many women in medieval society, this level of power was an illusion. Courtly love, after all, was largely a fantasy. An idealized version of romantic relationships had little to do with the harsh realities of life for most women. In real life, women had very little control over their sexual experiences. The strict religious and societal expectations around sex meant that women's bodies were seen as property, either of their fathers before marriage or of their husbands afterward. Women who violated these expectations, whether by seeking out pleasure outside of marriage or engaging in any form of sexual activity deemed inappropriate, were often punished, ostracized, or worse. And let's not forget about the darker side of medieval sexual education: sexual violence. The topic of sexual violence, particularly rape and abuse within marriage, was often swept under the rug in medieval society. The prevailing belief was that women were meant to submit to their husbands, and that any sexual activity within marriage was by default consensual. This attitude meant that women had little recourse if they were victimized by their husbands or another man in their lives. Sexual violence was not only common, but it was also largely ignored or justified by the idea that women's primary role was to serve men sexually and otherwise. As a result, medieval women's understanding of sex was fraught with contradictions. On the one hand, sex was something to be avoided unless it was for the purpose of procreation and keeping the family line alive. On the other hand, it was something to be feared, repressed, and punished if desired outside of its prescribed role. The church, society, and the medical establishment worked together to create an environment where women's sexuality was both deeply scrutinized and intensely restricted. For many women, sex was something to endure rather than something to enjoy. And it was largely shaped by the demands and expectations of the world around them. As the medieval period continued, societal attitudes towards sex and sexuality for women were also shaped by the complex relationship between power, class, and control. While much of what medieval women were taught about sex was focused on reproduction, chastity, and submission, it's crucial to understand that these lessons were not uniformly experienced across all social classes. For noble women and those of higher status, the rules and expectations were somewhat different, though still restrictive in many ways. Noble women, as we've discussed, were primarily seen as vessels for ensuring the continuation of family lines. However, in their case, there was often a more deliberate approach to managing sex and reproduction. Marriage was an economic transaction in the upper classes, and it wasn't unusual for noble women to marry young, sometimes to men much older than themselves, for the express purpose of securing alliances or political power. This meant that while these women may have had more education and resources, their sexual experiences were still largely defined by their roles as wives and mothers. Their main job was to provide heirs, and this came with a lot of pressure. The ability to produce a son was a central concern in medieval aristocracy, and the responsibility often fell squarely on the woman's shoulders. But despite these rigid expectations, noble women had access to some things that other women did not. They were more likely to receive some form of education, usually focused on religion, etiquette, and managing a household. Though the subject of sex was still largely absent from most formal teachings. In fact, the idea of pleasure was not just discouraged in marriage, but it was often seen as an unnecessary distraction. This was particularly true in the medieval Christian worldview, which tied women's bodies to notions of sin and temptation. While noble women had a higher chance of having their own private spaces where they could experience a bit of freedom, they still faced the same pressures as their less privileged counterparts to maintain a pure and dutiful role as wives. For peasant women, the situation was starkly different. There was little room for idealized views of love and marriage in the lower classes. These women were often married in their teens and immediately expected to bear children. In these more rural communities, sex wasn't seen as an institution that needed to be carefully managed with high levels of religiosity. Instead, it was seen as a necessary everyday part of life, especially for reproduction and the continuation of family work on the land. There wasn't much in the way of formal education for peasant girls about sex. Most of what they learned came from their mothers or older women in the community, and most of it revolved around practical knowledge for managing pregnancies and raising children. Pleasure, of course, was rarely discussed and certainly not in a formal sense. It was likely considered an afterthought, secondary to the task of bearing children and maintaining a family. One particularly interesting facet of medieval sexual education, and one that doesn't get a lot of attention in mainstream discussions, is the role that female sexuality played in the literature of the time. Courtly love, a form of chivalric romance that flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries, was a genre that depicted highly idealized versions of love, desire, and sexual attraction. In these tales, women were often portrayed as figures of unattainable beauty and virtue who were adored and pursued by knights or other male figures. While this might sound like harmless fantasy, it had real effects on how people, especially women, understood their own roles in relationships. Courtly love literature presented women as objects of desire who could inspire profound emotional and spiritual devotion in men. However, it was also highly idealized and often detached from the reality of medieval marriage. In these stories, sex was frequently used as a metaphor for something higher, usually unattainable love or devotion, but not for the biological or reproductive purposes that women were actually expected to fulfill. The female characters in courtly love stories often represented the pinnacle of purity and virtue as well as unattainable sexual ideals. These ideals contrasted sharply with the sexual expectations for real women. Real women, after all, weren't meant to embody the same kinds of sexual power or agency as the figures in these tales. Instead, they were meant to be subdued, modest, and chaste. Nevertheless, these works of literature had an impact on how medieval society viewed the relationship between women and sexuality. They gave rise to the idea of courtly love, which allowed for some degree of agency and control over sexual desire for women, albeit in an idealized, almost unattainable sense. For women in the upper classes, these stories might have offered an escape, a way to fantasize about a world where their beauty and virtue were celebrated, and where their sexuality was something powerful and respected. However, This was far removed from the reality they lived in, where their sexual experiences were often governed by duty and the pressures of marriage rather than romantic or erotic desire. While courtly love was one of the few instances where female sexuality was acknowledged as something powerful and desirable, it was still very much confined to the realm of fantasy. In real life, women in medieval society were taught to repress their sexual urges, to deny any pleasure outside of procreation, and to regard their sexuality as a necessary but not inherently positive aspect of their lives. Any desire beyond the confines of marriage, whether for pleasure or romantic love, was often viewed with suspicion or outright disdain. Women who were perceived as overly sexual or who expressed desire in ways deemed inappropriate could face severe consequences, including public shame or worse. This societal repression of female sexuality meant that many medieval women had little opportunity to explore or understand their own desires. Instead, they were taught to view sex with a mix of fear, shame, and duty. It wasn't until much later during the Renaissance and beyond that women began to experience a more liberated and more informed approach to their own sexual health and desires. But for most medieval women, their understanding of sex was shaped by the rigid and often contradictory teachings of religion, society, and culture. It was a deeply constricting system that left little room for individual expression, let alone pleasure. As we move further into the medieval era, it becomes clear that the concept of female sexuality was far more nuanced than simply repressing pleasure or avoiding sin. While much of medieval education for women focused on chastity, duty, and reproduction, there were spaces in society where women could, in subtle and sometimes hidden ways, navigate their own desires. Yet these moments of agency were rare and often tightly controlled. One key point to consider is how women in the medieval world were taught about sexual health, and how this intersected with the social and religious expectations placed upon them. For one, medical knowledge in the medieval period was a curious blend of ancient theories and medieval religious beliefs. The idea that women were inherently more prone to physical and emotional imbalances was widespread. Medieval physicians and philosophers often subscribed to the theory that women's bodies were more temperamental than men's, and that their sexual desires were particularly volatile. This belief stemmed from the ancient Greek and Roman ideas about the humors, bodily fluids believed to control a person's health. In this framework, women were thought to be governed by an excess of moisture, which made them more emotional, more sexually driven, and more prone to irrationality. Many medieval scholars influenced by Christian teachings also believed that female sexuality was linked to sinfulness, and that any form of sexual indulgence outside of procreation could lead to moral decay. This medical perspective contributed to the lack of accurate sexual education for women. For example, there were no formal lessons about anatomy or sexual health outside of the bare minimum required for childbirth. Midwives, however, played an essential role in women's lives, offering some of the only practical guidance about sexual health. While the church and male medical practitioners frequently focused on moral lessons, midwives were often the ones who provided more grounded hands-on knowledge about childbirth, reproduction, and sometimes even methods to manage fertility. They might have offered herbal remedies to control reproduction, though these were often hit or miss and at times dangerous. But this was in essence the medieval equivalent of women seeking control over their reproductive health in a world that offered them very few options. But the reality of medieval medical teachings wasn't always just about reproductive health. In fact, Many of the supposed ailments attributed to women were rooted in social and religious fears rather than physical realities. One of the most prevalent conditions was hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any emotional or physical symptoms that didn't fit neatly into other categories. Medieval women who experienced frustration, depression, or even sexual desire were often diagnosed with hysteria. This label was used as a way to control women's behavior and reinforce their role as docile, obedient beings. It also highlighted how medical understandings of women's bodies were often based on stereotypes rather than real anatomical or physiological knowledge. The very idea that women were ill because of their sexuality or their desires reveals just how deeply ingrained the belief was that female sexuality was something to be suppressed and controlled. Ironically, despite the medical community's attempts to control women's bodies and behaviors, women were often the ones with the most practical knowledge about their own reproductive systems. In many ways, the practical education women received came from their mothers, grandmothers, or other women in their communities. Midwives, as mentioned before, often served as the bridge between the formal male-dominated medical world and the more organic lived experience of women's bodies. For example, women in peasant communities might have learned about birth control, herbal remedies, or even how to detect early pregnancy from the midwife who attended births. These pieces of knowledge were critical in a time when many women faced high rates of maternal mortality, and the ability to navigate pregnancy and childbirth could quite literally mean life or death. Yet, this practical knowledge was often overshadowed by the dominant medical and religious teachings that sought to impose strict moral codes on women's sexuality. Despite this emphasis on control and repression, there were still moments where women managed to gain some degree of autonomy over their sexual lives, however small. For instance, some noble women were able to exercise a certain amount of influence in the sexual relationships with their husbands, particularly when it came to the pace and timing of producing heirs. Though marriages were arranged for political or economic reasons, women were not completely powerless within them. Some women, particularly in the aristocracy, might have been able to delay pregnancy or avoid sexual relations when they deemed it necessary. However, these decisions were often influenced by the need to produce male heirs, making women's sexual agency still tethered to societal expectations. Even within this restricted space, there were women who managed to assert a level of control. But such moments were exceptional, not the norm. For most medieval women, sexual education was still about avoiding sin and fulfilling their reproductive roles. The idea of pleasure was almost entirely absent from these teachings, and women were generally expected to subdue their own desires in favor of fulfilling the needs of their husbands, families, and society. The assumption was that sex was something women should endure, not enjoy, and that any enjoyment of sex was a potential gateway to sin. This attitude reinforced the broader belief that a woman's primary worth came from her ability to marry, reproduce, and remain sexually pure for her husband. But as with many aspects of medieval life, there were contradictions and some spaces where women could find subtle forms of resistance. For instance, while most women were expected to maintain chastity before marriage, there were instances in history where women in lower social classes could explore their sexuality outside the boundaries of traditional marriage. These women, often from lower or working-class backgrounds, might have had more informal sexual education passed down from their peers. For them, sex was not simply about reproduction, and often not about morality either. It was a part of everyday life and something to be navigated as best they could. Nonetheless, These informal, sometimes hidden forms of sexual knowledge were largely excluded from the formal teachings and historical records that predominantly focus on the upper classes. The real lives of medieval women were far messier and more complex than what we often imagine based on the strict moral codes they were taught. Their understanding of sex was shaped by a wide array of forces, religious, societal, and even practical. But in the end, it was an understanding that emphasized control, suppression, and duty, far more than it ever addressed the potential for pleasure, autonomy, or sexual freedom. As we delve further into the medieval period, it's important to understand the broader cultural context in which women's sexuality was understood. Beyond the teachings of the Church and the practices of medical professionals, medieval women's sexual education was also shaped by literature, art, and law. These influences played a significant role in reinforcing or challenging the societal norms surrounding female sexuality, and at times offered women a complex web of messages that were often contradictory. On one hand, women were encouraged to be virtuous and chaste. On the other, they were often depicted in ways that highlighted their sexuality, sometimes even idealizing it. Medieval literature, particularly the genre of courtly love, had a significant impact on shaping the concept of women's sexuality during this time. In these tales, women were portrayed as the objects of male desire, often set on pedestals and admired for their beauty, virtue, and sexual allure. The relationship between knights and ladies in courtly love literature was often idealized, with the woman being the subject of devotion, worship, and sometimes even sexual conquest. While this might sound like a celebration of female sexual power, it was in reality a very controlled form of sexual power. Women in these stories were portrayed as passive objects of male desire, with their sexuality being something to be admired but never fully accessed. These women might have the ability to inspire great devotion, but they were never meant to act on their own desires. In this context, sex was often seen as a symbol of unattainable perfection. Courtly love, with its focus on idealized, often platonic love between knights and ladies, frequently portrayed sexual desire as something that transcended the physical act. The woman's role in this idolized vision was to maintain her chastity and to inspire pure, unrequited love in her suitor. This portrayal of women as objects of devotion and desire could have a complex effect on real medieval women, especially those of noble birth. On one hand, it might have provided an escape from the oppressive expectations placed on them as wives and mothers. On the other, it reinforced the idea that women's value was tied to their sexual purity and the ability to inspire devotion, but not necessarily to express their own desires. For many women, especially those in the upper echelons of society, the concept of courtly love may have provided a way to feel valued for more than just their roles as wives or mothers. But for the majority of medieval women, particularly those from lower classes, the reality was far less glamorous. Their sexual lives were often less about romance and more about survival. In peasant communities, marriage was less about love or courtship and more about necessity. Women were expected to contribute to the household and bear children to help with labor. The physical and emotional toll of this was immense. The idea of courtly love with its focus on unattainable beauty and purity was as distant from their everyday lives as could be imagined. However, the societal focus on women's sexual purity was not just restricted to the realm of literature. legal and social structures also had a profound impact on how women were taught about sex. The law in medieval Europe reflected the idea that women's sexuality was something that needed to be controlled and managed. In some parts of Europe, the legal system imposed harsh penalties on women who were suspected of engaging in sexual activity outside of marriage. In many cases, women who were accused of adultery or even having premarital sex could face severe punishment, ranging from public shaming to outright execution. This legal framework further reinforced the idea that a woman's sexual life was something that needed to be tightly monitored with little room for deviation from societal norms. But it wasn't just punishment that shaped medieval women's understanding of sex. There was also the concept of honor, which played a significant role in how women's sexuality was viewed. A woman's honor was closely tied to her virginity, purity, and faithfulness. In many ways, a woman's entire social standing could be determined by the state of her honor. If a woman was deemed to have lost her virginity before marriage, or worse, if she was caught in an extramarital affair, it could ruin her reputation and make her a social pariah. This was especially true in noble families where the preservation of family honor was paramount. For women in these social circles, the pressure to remain chaste was immense, as it was not just their personal reputation at stake, but the reputation of their entire family. This social obsession with female honor led to some rather strange cultural practices. In some parts of medieval Europe, fathers would take extreme measures to ensure their daughter's virginity until marriage. Some even went so far as to lock their daughters away in convents or secluded rooms to prevent them from being seduced. Others took measures to ensure that their daughter's sexual purity was protected by imposing strict rules on their behavior, restricting their interactions with men, and keeping them under constant surveillance. In these contexts, sex was not just about procreation or duty. It was a commodity, something that could be used to protect or destroy a family's social standing. A woman's worth was often measured by how well she adhered to the moral codes that governed her sexuality. For women who were not part of the noble classes, the pressure to maintain sexual purity was still present, but in a different form. Peasant women, for example, were often married off at a young age and expected to bear children quickly. While the social consequences for premarital sex were less severe than for noble women, there were still significant repercussions. A woman who was found to be pregnant outside of wedlock might face social ostracism, or worse, be accused of witchcraft or sorcery, especially if the pregnancy was seen as the result of an illicit relationship. The law often gave men the power to dictate women's sexual lives. But for women in lower social classes, their sexual autonomy was even further limited by the rigid social structures they inhabited. In both noble and peasant communities, the cultural narrative surrounding female sexuality was largely shaped by fear. Fear of women's power, fear of sexual transgression, and fear of the unknown. This fear permeated all levels of medieval society, shaping how women were educated about sex, how they were expected to behave, and how their sexual behavior was policed. As we've seen, medieval women were rarely taught about their own bodies in any practical way, and their sexual education was typically filtered through a lens of duty, sin, and societal expectations. The idea that sex could be an enjoyable or empowering experience was largely absent from their teachings. Despite the overwhelming focus on duty and control, there were, as always, exceptions and outliers in the medieval world. While most women were taught that their sexuality was a burden or a responsibility tied to procreation, there were women who found subtle ways to navigate these rigid expectations. While they certainly didn't have the freedom we associate with modern concepts of sexual autonomy, some women were able to assert a degree of control over their sexual lives, albeit in often indirect and limited ways. For instance, women in the courts of medieval Europe, particularly in the high nobility, sometimes had more freedom when it came to matters of love and sex. While marriages in these circles were still largely about alliances and securing heirs, there was a degree of social maneuvering that allowed women to influence their sexual and marital lives. In many cases, noble women could form powerful relationships with their husbands or lovers. The idea of a marriage of convenience was common, but so too were the conceptions of passionate, albeit often illicit relationships that could complicate the otherwise rigid rules surrounding noble marriages. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Christine de Pizan managed to carve out influential roles for themselves in societies that otherwise expected them to be passive and subservient. These women didn't just wield power through their husbands or families. They sometimes had the agency to shape the course of their own sexual lives. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who'd been married to both the King of France and the King of England, was known to have had romantic affairs throughout her life. Though her affairs were likely scandalous in their time, they also signaled a degree of independence from the strict marital expectations placed on women. Eleanor, along with others of her rank, was able to leverage her sexuality and romantic relationships to influence the political world around her in a way that most medieval women could not even dream of. In addition to noble women who exerted subtle forms of control, there were also certain religious women who found ways to express their sexuality or desires in indirect forms. While nuns were expected to suppress their sexual urges entirely, some religious figures became influential for their writings or actions. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess, is an example of a woman who, while adhering to the strictest codes of celibacy, found a powerful outlet for her spiritual and intellectual expression. Hildegard's works, which included writings on medicine, theology, and sexuality, reveal a nuanced understanding of the female body and the ways in which women could navigate spiritual and physical desires. Although she was an advocate for chastity, her work acknowledged the complexities of female sexuality and the challenges of maintaining purity in a world where women's bodies were seen as inherently sinful. Despite these examples, the reality for most women remained starkly different. The majority of medieval women, especially those in lower classes, did not have the same access to power, freedom, or influence that elite women might have had. For the majority of women, marriage was a strict social contract where sex was once again about duty and procreation. There was little space for individual expression, let alone for the exploration of sexual pleasure. Women were expected to fulfill their role as wives and mothers without question. And any deviation from that expectation could result in severe social punishment, even if their transgressions were private and personal. For many, this meant an entire lifetime spent suppressing their desires, both emotional and physical. The concept of love in the romantic sense was often idealized, but largely unattainable for most women. Their lives were more concerned with survival, childbearing, and maintaining the household. And for those who did seek out pleasure or desire outside of marriage, the consequences could be dire. Women who stepped outside the boundaries of sexual norms were often labeled as immoral, and in some cases were accused of witchcraft or other forms of deviance. This fear of female sexuality and the lengths to which society would go to suppress it speaks to the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures that governed medieval life. Yet, even in these oppressive environments, women found ways to express themselves. The medieval period wasn't just about religious repression and strict sexual codes. It was also a time when women's roles, though limited, were occasionally recognized in both formal and informal ways. The work of midwives, the writings of saints and mystics, and the political influence of certain noble women all highlight the ways in which women could assert themselves, even when constrained by rigid social and religious expectations. These women may have been exceptions to the rule, but their stories offer glimpses into the ways in which medieval women navigated a world that largely silenced them. In the realm of sexual knowledge, there were also some subtle acts of resistance. While most women weren't formally taught about sexual health or pleasure, there were pockets of knowledge that women could access. Midwives once again played a central role in this. They were the ones who helped women manage pregnancies, provided advice on reproductive health, and sometimes in private offered counsel on managing sexual relations with their husbands. In rural areas where access to formal education was often limited, this informal network of knowledge was vital for women who were trying to make sense of their bodies in a world where much of the relevant information was shrouded in silence or taboo. But for the majority of medieval women, their sexual education was limited to what they could glean from whispered conversations, from the occasional advice of older women in their families, and from the religious authorities who told them that their sexuality was something that needed to be controlled and restricted. This meant that most women's understanding of sex remained framed within a context of sin, reproduction, and duty. Any hint of pleasure was seen as dangerous, and the reality of women's sexual needs was ignored or suppressed. And yet, despite the vast sea of repression, women did manage to experience and understand their own sexuality in ways that were not always dictated by religious and social norms. While medieval teachings about sex were largely negative and restrictive, the lives of these women were far more complex than the strict moral codes prescribed. In a society that sought to control their bodies and desires, many women still found ways to navigate their sexuality, even if it was done in secret within the constraints of their time. As we continue to explore the complexities of medieval women's sexual education, it's important to examine how these experiences were shaped by their understanding of sin, virtue, and the eternal consequences of their actions. Religion, and particularly the Catholic Church, held significant sway over the lives of women. The Church not only dictated what was deemed morally acceptable, but also defined what women were supposed to believe about their own bodies, desires, and roles in society. In this context, sex was not simply a private or personal matter. It was a deeply spiritual one, and the consequences of engaging in sexual activity, whether inside or outside of marriage, were understood as having eternal ramifications. For many women, especially those from devout families or religious communities, their understanding of sexuality was rooted in the belief that their bodies were impure, their desires dangerous, and their sexual thoughts sinful. The Church placed an enormous emphasis on virginity and chastity, teaching that the ideal woman was pure and untouched. This ideal was closely tied to the concept of spiritual salvation. A woman's purity before marriage was considered a direct reflection of her moral and spiritual worth, and losing that purity before marriage, or worse, after marriage, could have grave consequences both in this life and the next. Women who fell into sin, particularly sexual sin, were often seen as weak, morally corrupt, or even demonic. The teachings surrounding virginity and chastity were often compounded by fear. Fear of eternal damnation, fear of displeasing God, and fear of social ostracism. A woman who lost her virginity outside of marriage, or who was suspected of engaging in any sexual activity before marriage, could face immense shame and social consequences. The fear of sexual transgression permeated everyday life, and for many women it was a constant pressure to conform to societal and religious expectations. This led to widespread anxiety and confusion as many women struggled with the complex relationship between their bodies and the moral codes placed upon them. The fear of sin and the anxiety surrounding sexuality contributed to a culture where silence and ignorance about sexual matters were more common than open discussion. In medieval society, women's sexual education was thus not just about understanding the act of sex, but about coming to terms with the consequences of engaging in it. It was not enough to simply learn the mechanics of reproduction. Women were taught to fear the act itself, to repress any feelings of desire, and to believe that sexual pleasure could lead them down a path of moral ruin. Any form of sexual enjoyment, whether within or outside of marriage, was seen as a temptation that needed to be resisted at all costs. The idea that women could enjoy sex, or that sex could be about anything other than procreation, was almost entirely absent from medieval teachings. This fear-driven understanding of sex didn't just stop at education. It also shaped women's experiences of marriage and their relationships with their husbands. For medieval women, marriage was a complex, often burdensome institution. While the ultimate goal of marriage was to produce heirs and maintain family lines, it also had a significant sexual component. However, the act of sex within marriage was viewed with suspicion by the Church, as it was believed that even within this sacred union, women might be tempted by lust. The Church's teachings on marital sex focused primarily on the idea of procreation, not pleasure. The act of sex was only morally acceptable if it resulted in the conception of children, and any other purpose, such as mutual satisfaction or bonding, was often seen as secondary or even sinful. This led to a strange paradox. Women were expected to engage in sex within marriage to fulfill their duty to God and their husbands, but they were simultaneously taught to view it as a necessary evil. The idea that women could take pleasure in sex was deeply problematic in medieval thought, and many women internalized this belief. For women in marriage, sex was often seen as something to be endured, something that could lead to the creation of children, but also something that could lead them down the slippery slope of sin. This complicated relationship between sex, duty, and morality created immense psychological pressure for women who were left with little room to explore their own desires, or understand the potential for intimacy beyond the rigid, religiously defined boundaries. This issue of pleasure versus duty was further complicated by the medieval understanding of women's emotional and psychological well-being. For centuries, the idea of female hysteria was a dominant theory explaining any behavior that strayed from the accepted norms of feminine behavior. If a woman expressed too much sexual desire or appeared emotionally distraught due to a lack of sexual fulfillment, she might be labeled as hysterical, a diagnosis often used to explain the emotional complexities of female sexuality. Hysteria was attributed to women's weak constitutions, their perceived inability to control their emotions, and the assumption that their sexual desires were inherently disruptive. This view placed even more pressure on women to conform to sexual norms, and reinforced the idea that women's sexuality was something to be feared rather than understood. There was, however, a contradiction within medieval thinking about women's sexuality. On the one hand, women were seen as inherently sinful and sexually dangerous. But on the other hand, they were also revered as the vessels for the future of humanity. The Madonna, for instance, was the ideal of female purity and grace, a model of sexual purity that medieval women were encouraged to emulate. But the story of the Virgin Mary was also paradoxical. She was the mother of Christ, the ultimate symbol of motherhood. Yet, she was untouched by sin, untouched by the sexual act. This representation of women as both revered virgins and revered mothers created a complex and often conflicting framework for how medieval women understood their roles in society and in the bedroom. In many ways, these conflicting beliefs about women's sexuality were deeply limiting. While women could take pride in their role as mothers and bearers of life, their sexuality was something that needed to be suppressed, hidden, or controlled. The fear of sin and the cultural narrative of sexual purity imposed severe limitations on women's understanding of their own bodies and desires. While some may have found ways to assert their sexuality through religious or literary means, the vast majority of women were left to navigate a deeply repressive system where their sexuality was defined by sin, shame, and silence. As we delve even deeper into the lives of medieval women, it's important to consider the long-lasting impact of the religious and societal teachings on sexuality that shaped their experiences. These teachings not only guided women's perceptions of their bodies, desires, and roles, but also formed the foundation for how sexual behavior was viewed by society at large. The rigid boundaries placed around women's sexuality didn't just affect their personal lives. They shaped the very structure of medieval society, reinforcing power dynamics and limiting the scope of women's autonomy. Yet within these limitations, some women still managed to assert themselves and express their sexuality in ways that weren't always in line with the prescribed norms. One of the more subtle yet powerful ways that medieval women might have asserted control over their sexuality was through the practice of choosing not to marry. While marriage was the expected norm for women, some women chose or were forced by circumstances to remain single throughout their lives. This decision, though sometimes viewed with suspicion or even disdain by society, could offer a form of freedom from the constraints of marital duty. Women who chose to remain unmarried had more flexibility in how they managed their sexual lives. While they were still subject to the religious and social expectations surrounding chastity, they weren't directly bound by the reproductive demands of marriage. These women often engaged in other forms of social life, from running businesses to participating in religious communities where they could exercise some form of control over their personal and sexual lives. Nuns, for example, chose celibacy but were often afforded a degree of intellectual freedom which was rare for women at the time. The role of nuns in the medieval period, though steeped in religious devotion, reveals how women could navigate sexual expectations. While they were expected to live completely celibate lives, nuns were also able to carve out some space for self-expression and intellectual independence. In religious orders, women were often involved in the creation of art, literature, and theology, endeavors that allowed them to express themselves in ways that transcended the traditional confines of sex and marriage. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, who was both a mystic and a scholar, became influential figures in the medieval world. While their celibacy was considered virtuous, their intellectual output and spiritual contributions allowed them to play a significant role in shaping religious and cultural life, even if it was on the margins of the wider society. However, The majority of women, particularly those from lower social classes, did not have the luxury of choosing a life of celibacy or intellectual pursuit. For most, marriage was inevitable, and sex within this institution was part of the social contract. The challenge for these women was navigating the restrictions placed on their sexual lives while trying to meet the expectations of motherhood and wifely duty. A woman's sexual identity was closely tied to her role as a mother. Childbearing, after all, was one of the most important and perhaps the only means of establishing a woman's worth in medieval society. The constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth left little room for personal expression of sexual desire. While some women might have found satisfaction in the birth of children, others may have found the burden of reproduction and sexual duty stifling. Yet regardless of how they felt, their lives were shaped by this reproductive expectation. It's also worth noting that the concept of marriage itself often wasn't about mutual sexual enjoyment or romantic connection. For many women, marriage was a social duty, a way to secure their family's financial future or position within the hierarchy of feudal society. Sex was seen as a means to an end, reproduction and the preservation of lineage. For many men, the idea of a woman's sexual pleasure was secondary, if it was considered at all. This imbalance of expectations meant that many women may not have even been encouraged to express desires or explore their sexuality in any meaningful way. Instead, they were taught that sex was a marital duty, a necessary act to keep the family going and secure. This created a deeply transactional view of sex where intimacy and desire were often not part of the equation. Though there were some examples of women who navigated the strict sexual codes of medieval life more successfully than others, the overall structure of society remained designed to suppress female sexuality. Women who did not adhere to the codes of chastity, modesty, and sexual submission were often stigmatized, sometimes labeled as witches, prostitutes, or immoral. The medieval legal system reinforced these ideals, and women who strayed from sexual norms could face severe punishment. A woman found guilty of adultery could be publicly shamed, stripped of her social standing, or even put to death. For many women, simply stepping outside the bounds of sexual respectability meant the loss of their reputation and status. In this deeply repressive environment, the few spaces where women could have some degree of autonomy over their sexual lives were often fleeting and fragile. Even so, these moments of freedom, whether in the form of intellectual pursuits, a life of celibacy, or private sexual agency, reveal the ways in which women tried to make sense of their sexual identities. In the absence of formal sexual education that acknowledged women's desires or bodies as fully their own, women created their own forms of knowledge through relationships with midwives, by sharing experiences with other women, and by exploring the small amounts of autonomy available to them. Many women found ways to navigate the constraints placed upon them. While it is tempting to paint a picture of medieval women as purely victims of a repressive society, the reality is more complex. Yes, medieval women were subject to severe constraints when it came to their sexuality. But within those constraints, many found ways to exercise subtle forms of agency, whether through intellectual work in religious communities, limited control over their bodies through non-marital relationships, or by simply managing the emotional and psychological toll of their sexual education. Medieval women were far from passive. They lived within a deeply patriarchal system, but they also managed in small ways to navigate that system, sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly. As we consider the experiences of medieval women and their sexual education, it's also important to recognize the power of the medieval church in shaping the narrative surrounding sex and sexuality. While much of this power was wielded in ways that repressed women's sexual autonomy, there were instances where the church's influence was more ambiguous, especially when we look at the way women's sexuality was discussed in mystical, theological, and religious writings. The church's authority over medieval life was vast, touching everything from marriage to sexuality to the very nature of women's bodies. However, some religious texts written by women subtly pushed against the rigid framework set out by the church, revealing a more complex relationship between women, sex, and spirituality. One such space where female sexuality was discussed with nuance was in the mystical writings of female saints and religious figures. These women, though often bound by the same expectations of chastity and submission, found ways to express their sexual identities in ways that both challenged and complied with church teachings. Saints like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena were able to exert a degree of spiritual and intellectual influence that allowed them to speak about their bodies and desires in religious terms. Hildegard, for instance, was one of the most famous and influential women of the medieval period. As a mystic, composer, and theologian, she produced writings that, while rooted in religious devotion, often touched on topics of sexuality, womanhood, and the female body. In her work, Hildegard didn't just focus on the spiritual aspects of chastity. She also acknowledged the power of the female body. Her visions included symbolic representations of both feminine power and feminine suffering, which were often linked to sexual and reproductive experiences. While Hildegard upheld the Church's ideal of celibacy for nuns, she also offered a more complex and embodied vision of women's spiritual lives. Her work suggested that women could possess power through their sexuality, though this power was seen as something spiritual rather than physical. In this way, women like Hildegard navigated the intersection of sexuality and spirituality, giving voice to the idea that female sexuality, when contained within religious contexts, could be powerful and sacred rather than sinful. Catherine of Siena, another medieval mystic, also explored the idea of female agency within the constraints of religious life. Catherine was deeply devoted to Christ, and her writings focused on the importance of chastity and submission to God. However, her theology also touched on the themes of female empowerment. Catherine's intense religious devotion often involved erotic imagery, but these erotic experiences were framed as a union with God rather than with any earthly lover. In this way, Catherine and other mystics were able to frame sexual desire as a spiritual longing, further complicating the Church's strict moral codes. For these women, spirituality and sexuality were not always in opposition. Instead, they sometimes merged into a form of religious ecstasy that allowed them to experience intimacy in a way that transcended traditional sexual roles. While mysticism allowed for a more fluid understanding of female sexuality, it was still deeply embedded in religious frameworks that prescribed a narrow range of sexual behavior for women. These spiritual explorations, though empowering, were still often positioned as alternatives to sexual activity with men. The ideal of virginity, particularly for women, was upheld as the highest state of being, and chastity was often seen as a form of ultimate purity and devotion. For many medieval women, the allure of virginity was not just spiritual but social. It was a way to secure a place in a world that prized women for their ability to remain untouched and pure. Outside the cloisters, however, the realities of medieval marriage continued to reflect the pressures and restrictions placed on women's sexuality. In the eyes of the Church, marriage was considered a sacrament, and thus any sexual activity within marriage was morally acceptable as long as it was for the purpose of procreation. But for many women, sex within marriage wasn't about romantic connection, desire, or pleasure. It was a duty, a responsibility to ensure the continuation of family lines and the strengthening of social alliances. For women in the lower classes, marriage often meant a life of constant childbirth and household labor, leaving little room for the expression of sexual desire beyond its functional purpose. Still, there were women who found ways to navigate the tension between sexual duty and personal desire. While most medieval women were expected to endure the act of sex for the sake of reproduction, there were those who might have found a modicum of pleasure in it. Though sexual pleasure was rarely acknowledged as legitimate in medieval teachings, the reality of human intimacy likely made it a more complex experience than what was taught. Some women, particularly in more private or informal settings, may have learned about sexual pleasure through shared experiences with other women or through the guidance of midwives who possessed a more practical hands-on knowledge of the female body. These women, though still constrained by the prevailing moral codes, could assert some measure of control over their sexual lives, even if it was in subtle, often unspoken ways. For most women, however, sexual education remained confined within the boundaries set by religion and societal expectations. The idea of pleasure as an integral part of sexual activity simply didn't exist for many medieval women. Instead, their education centered on avoidance of sin, the importance of chastity, and the sanctity of marriage. Sex was seen as a tool for reproduction and a means of fulfilling one's marital duty and little else. As such, the sexual lives of medieval women were often defined by what they were not allowed to do, what they were not allowed to desire, not allowed to explore, not allowed to enjoy. Even so, the silence surrounding female sexuality didn't mean that it was absent from medieval life. Women's bodies were central to the continuity of society, whether through childbirth, marriage, or religious devotion. In this complex web of expectations, it's clear that medieval women were often caught between their own desires and the constraints placed upon them. Whether they were engaging in religious mysticism or fulfilling their roles as wives and mothers, medieval women were constantly negotiating the terms of their sexual education. In many ways, they were not merely passive recipients of societal teachings, but active participants in shaping the ways they understood their bodies and sexuality. Sometimes subtly, sometimes powerfully, but always within the context of an overwhelmingly restrictive world. While we have focused heavily on how religious institutions shaped the medieval understanding of female sexuality, it's important to consider how secular forces also played a role. The complex interplay of law, custom, and social expectations helped reinforce the boundaries placed around women's bodies. Marriage, law, and economic necessity were tightly woven into the fabric of everyday life, influencing how women were taught to view sex and their sexual identities. While religious teachings may have been the most vocal about women's roles, secular authorities were often just as invested in controlling female sexuality, often with dire consequences for those who stepped outside the established norms. In medieval Europe, marriage was more than just a personal relationship. It was an economic and social contract. families used marriage as a tool to ensure their economic survival and to strengthen alliances. Women, particularly from noble or wealthy families, were often married off to men they had never met. And this arranged marriage was usually based on the needs and desires of the family, not the individual woman. In these circumstances, sex within marriage was seen as a necessary means of producing heirs, not as a means of mutual affection or pleasure. Marriage was an institution that reflected the social and economic hierarchies of the time, and women's roles in these marriages were bound to the reproductive functions they served. The law, too, was deeply entwined with the control of female sexuality. The legal system in medieval Europe, while varied from region to region, generally reflected a belief that women's sexual lives needed to be strictly regulated. Adultery, for example, was one of the most serious crimes a woman could commit. If a woman was caught committing adultery, she could be subjected to public shaming, beatings, or even death depending on the severity of the crime. Men, on the other hand, faced far fewer consequences for extramarital affairs. This double standard existed not only in religious teachings, but in secular law as well, reinforcing the idea that a woman's sexuality was something to be protected, but also something that could be easily lost or tainted. Even in less severe cases, the laws surrounding marriage were aimed at controlling female sexuality. Women were often legally required to remain chaste until marriage, and once married, they were expected to be faithful to their husbands. The law in medieval Europe reinforced the notion that women's worth was tied to their virginity and sexual loyalty. This legal framework restricted women's autonomy, making it nearly impossible for them to live outside the boundaries of marriage without facing severe social and legal consequences. However, despite these restrictions, there were moments when women found ways to express and navigate their sexual lives in ways that defied the norms. One notable example can be found in the stories of women who engaged in relationships outside the boundaries of marriage, often in secret, but sometimes in open defiance of the social order. Women of higher social status, for example, had the ability to wield a certain amount of influence over their sexual relationships, even if these relationships were not officially recognized by the law. This often happened in the form of affairs or clandestine relationships with powerful men, which sometimes led to the birth of illegitimate children. Though these relationships were often frowned upon by society, they occasionally granted women a degree of power that was otherwise inaccessible to them. Some women even managed to manipulate their sexual relationships to gain influence or wealth, though this was a rare exception rather than the rule. For women in the lower classes, however, sexual autonomy was even more limited. They were often married at a young age and quickly expected to bear children with little control over their sexual relationships. Many of these women lived in small communities where their sexual lives were heavily scrutinized by their neighbors and family members. The expectation of childbearing meant that many women's sexual identities were reduced to their reproductive functions. In these communities, women who bore children out of wedlock were often ostracized, and the consequences of such actions could be severe. These women had very few resources to fall back on and faced a lifetime of social stigma. Many were labeled as fallen women or immoral, regardless of the circumstances of their pregnancies, and were often pushed to the margins of society. The role of midwives in these communities provides another interesting facet to the discussion of female sexuality. Midwives were often the only people who could offer women practical advice about sexual health, pregnancy, and childbirth. In some areas, midwives were viewed as a source of wisdom and knowledge, while in others, they were feared and accused of witchcraft. especially when their practices deviated from mainstream religious beliefs. The role of midwives shows how women in the medieval world often relied on each other for sexual knowledge, especially when formal education on the subject was limited or forbidden. These women, with their practical experience, became the gatekeepers of reproductive knowledge, offering advice on everything from contraceptive methods to managing difficult pregnancies. However, the knowledge shared between women was often seen as dangerous or subversive by the Church. The fact that midwives and other women who assisted with childbirth sometimes provided methods to control fertility indicates that there was some recognition, however subtle, of women's right to control their sexual lives. In some ways, these midwives acted as agents of sexual autonomy, offering women a way to navigate their reproductive roles without completely submitting to the rigid expectations placed upon them. This knowledge was often passed down through generations as older women taught younger women the practical skills they needed to manage their reproductive health in a world where such knowledge was often discouraged by the Church. Despite the immense pressures placed on medieval women, it is clear that women were not simply passive recipients of the sexual education and restrictions imposed upon them. Whether through defying marriage expectations, managing relationships with men in private, or sharing knowledge about fertility and sexual health, women found ways to navigate the rigid confines of medieval sexual norms. It's a testament to their resilience that even in a time when women were largely silenced and oppressed, they still managed to carve out spaces of resistance and autonomy. These small acts of resistance, though often invisible in the historical record, reveal the ways in which women were able to assert some control over their sexual lives, even in the most oppressive of circumstances. As we continue exploring the medieval experience of female sexuality, it's important to acknowledge the wider cultural and intellectual currents that shaped how medieval society viewed women's sexual roles. Medieval women were not isolated from the broader philosophical, artistic, and literary traditions of their time. While many of these traditions were dominated by male voices, there were still important ways in which women's sexual identities and experiences were reflected and refracted in literature, art, and intellectual discourse. In particular, the way women were portrayed in literature, from chivalric romances to religious texts, played a crucial role in shaping public perceptions of their sexuality. The literary tradition, though often based on ideals rather than realities, offered a fascinating glimpse into how women's sexuality was both revered and feared. In the world of medieval literature, especially in the courtly love tradition, women were frequently idealized as pure, untouchable objects of desire. Knights and noblemen would embark on dangerous quests to win the favor of ladies who were often depicted as unattainable and highly virtuous. These women were celebrated for their beauty, their grace, and their moral perfection. Yet this idealization also came with its own set of restrictions. Women in these stories were frequently portrayed as passive recipients of male desire, objects of affection rather than active participants in relationships. The message here was clear. While women's sexuality was revered and highly sought after, it was also dangerous and ultimately something that should be controlled. Courtly love, which flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries, celebrated the woman's role as the object of devotion. In this tradition, love was often portrayed as an unconsummated ideal, a form of spiritual devotion that transcended physical sex. While the knights in these tales often desired their ladies and performed great feats to earn their affection, the relationship was understood to be one where the woman remained untouchable and the true nature of sexuality was often abstracted or idealized. For medieval women, these tales might have offered a sense of empowerment in their ability to inspire such devotion, but the actual experience of love and sexuality was quite different. In real life, women were expected to remain sexually passive, their bodies destined for marriage and childbearing, not for the romantic escapades glorified in these stories. Despite the idolization in literature, there was also an undercurrent of fear surrounding female sexuality in the medieval period. Women's sexual desires, particularly outside the boundaries of marriage, were seen as dangerous, chaotic, and potentially subversive. Women were often portrayed as the bearers of temptation, as seen in religious texts that emphasized Eve's role in leading Adam into sin. This fear of women's sexuality was further exacerbated by societal beliefs that women were more susceptible to the devil's influence due to their inherent weakness and sinful nature. In these narratives, women's sexuality was often linked to moral and spiritual corruption, painting women as vessels of temptation who could, if not properly controlled, bring about the downfall of men and society. Interestingly, this duality, reverence, and fear was reflected in the way that women were portrayed in religious and moral teachings. Religious texts, particularly those from the Church Fathers, often portrayed women as both spiritually pure and deeply flawed. They were revered for their capacity to bear life and care for the household. Yet their sexuality was viewed with suspicion. The Virgin Mary, as the embodiment of feminine purity, represented the ideal woman, one who was untouched and without sin. However, this ideal was not one that could be easily attained by real women. For most medieval women, the expectation was to be chaste, obedient, and sexually reserved. Yet their bodies remained a source of anxiety, fear, and control. On the flip side, there were also more radical representations of female sexuality in medieval literature and philosophy. Some female saints and mystics like Hildegard of Bingen were able to articulate a more complex relationship with sexuality, one that was not strictly bound by the Church's prescriptions. These women often wrote about spiritual or mystical experiences that included sexual imagery, but framed it as a form of divine ecstasy or union with God. For them, the experience of sexual desire was transformed into something transcendent, not necessarily sinful, but connected to their deep spiritual connection with the divine. These texts, while rare, were part of a larger conversation that suggested female sexuality could be reinterpreted outside of the strict moral constraints placed on it. In a sense, these more radical interpretations of female sexuality provided a space where women could express and explore their desires without fear of damnation. Yet for the majority of women in medieval society, this was not the reality they faced. Most women's sexual education was restricted to the basic tenets of Christian morality: avoid sin, maintain purity, and fulfill one's marital duty. Any deviation from these teachings was seen as sinful or even criminal. The social and religious structures surrounding female sexuality were so tightly controlled that even the possibility of female sexual pleasure was rarely acknowledged. Women's sexual lives were in many ways defined not by their own desires, but by what society and religion dictated they should desire. Medieval art also played a significant role in reinforcing these ideals. Though much of medieval visual art focused on religious subjects, there were still occasional depictions of the human body, often seen in works of biblical or mythological nature. These artworks were sometimes used to convey moral lessons about sexual purity and sin. For instance, depictions of Adam and Eve or the Virgin Mary often emphasize the dual nature of female sexuality, the potential for both purity and temptation. In these images, women's bodies were not just objects of desire, but were frequently shown as vessels for moral and spiritual lessons. These artistic representations, though intended to educate, also reinforce the cultural duality of female sexuality. Women were both revered and feared, celebrated and suppressed. Perhaps one of the most significant aspects of medieval female sexuality that often goes overlooked is how women's sexual lives were understood through the lens of economic necessity. For women of lower social status, sex and marriage were not merely about personal fulfillment or religious duty. They were vital aspects of survival. The act of marriage was often a means of securing financial support, and sex within marriage was directly tied to the economic function of reproduction. Children were seen as workers who would contribute to the family's labor force, especially on farms. This utilitarian view of marriage and sex meant that women's sexual experiences were closely connected to their family's economic stability and social mobility, and were less likely to be seen as personal or romantic in nature. For women in these circumstances, sexual education often came down to the basics: how to bear children, how to manage pregnancies, and how to fulfill their duties as wives and mothers. The idea of sexual pleasure was virtually non-existent in this context. While women of higher social status might have had some room for autonomy in their sexual lives, for those in the lower classes, sex was simply another part of their economic function, and any desire outside of that was rarely acknowledged. This economic lens through which women's sexuality was viewed further reinforced the notion that sex was not for enjoyment, but for fulfilling societal and economic roles. As we move through the medieval period, it becomes increasingly clear that despite the harsh restrictions on women's sexuality, there was still a deep human drive for intimacy, desire, and personal autonomy that could not be entirely suppressed. While many women were bound by the rigid structures of marriage, chastity, and religious expectations, they were also active agents in navigating the complex systems of power that dictated their sexual lives. The medieval world, with all its layers of repression and control, was not as monolithic as we might imagine. Women found ways to assert themselves, sometimes overtly, often in quiet and subtle ways, in the spaces they were given. Understanding this complexity helps us appreciate the resilience and agency of women during a time that sought to limit both. One of the more striking aspects of medieval women's lives was their engagement with sexuality in ways that were often unspoken, hidden, or encoded in metaphor. Although medieval women were rarely encouraged to explore or openly discuss their sexual desires, there were spaces where sexuality could be expressed. Sometimes through the language of religious devotion, sometimes through the acts of motherhood, and occasional through art and literature. It's important to acknowledge that while the Church's teachings dominated public discourse, women often found ways to communicate their sexual and emotional lives in coded or indirect ways, using the language of devotion, mysticism, and the body. This allowed them to maintain a level of autonomy and self-expression even in the most restrictive environments. In religious texts, for instance, many female saints and mystics used spiritual experiences that mirrored sexual ecstasy to express their deep longing for union with God. The writings of these women, such as those of Teresa of Avila or Hildegard of Bingen, often contained intense language of desire and surrender. Yet this desire was always framed within the context of religious devotion. These spiritual marriages were for these women a way to experience intimacy and fulfillment that was otherwise prohibited in their earthly lives. Though they were meant to be celibate, these women created spaces for themselves to explore their own feelings of longing, need, and even sexual release, albeit framed through a divine lens. In doing so, they pushed back against the idea that women could not experience deep, passionate connection. While this kind of spiritualized sexuality was unique to women within religious orders, the broader cultural context of love and relationships allowed for some subtle rebellions. The courtly love tradition, which was often a product of the high medieval aristocracy, presented an idealized form of female sexuality that, while still largely focused on men's devotion to unattainable women, offered a different interpretation of sexual power. In courtly love, women were revered as objects of desire and adoration. But the relationship between knight and lady was often non-physical, emphasizing a kind of love that transcended mere lust. This idealized portrayal of women may have offered some noble women a way to express their sexual and emotional needs indirectly. Through the language of chivalry and devotion, women in these stories held a kind of power that was rarely afforded to them in real life. However, outside the fantasy world of courtly love, the lives of most women in medieval society were far more practical. For these women, the expression of sexuality was often confined to marriage, childbearing, and the fulfillment of societal duties. Still, there were moments when women might have exercised a degree of control over their sexual lives. For instance, in medieval peasant communities, where marriage and family were crucial to economic survival, there was less oversight by religious authorities and societal norms than in more urban or noble settings. In these rural areas, women had a bit more leeway to negotiate sexual relations with their husbands, especially when it came to managing the family's economic needs. Childbearing might have been an ongoing concern, but there was also a sense of practicality to how women interacted with their bodies. Women often learned from older generations how to manage their fertility and regulate births. These practical skills were crucial for maintaining a family's resources and ensuring the survival of the household. In many ways, women's ability to exercise control over their sexual lives was more directly linked to their economic and social circumstances. Noble women, though subject to the same moral and religious teachings as their peers, often had more power over their sexual relationships, particularly if they were able to leverage their status in marriage. For example, women who controlled wealth and land could sometimes negotiate the terms of their marriages, potentially delaying childbirth or even controlling the timing of sexual relations with their husbands. Though these women were still constrained by the societal expectations, their social standing allowed them a degree of influence that was unavailable to women in lower classes. Nonetheless, for the majority of women in medieval Europe, marriage was not about mutual affection or sexual pleasure. It was an economic and social institution, and sexual relations were part of the wider responsibilities that women had to their families and communities. This was especially true in the lower classes where marriage was primarily a tool for survival. In these cases, sex was often seen as a necessary duty rather than something to be enjoyed or actively sought. Women's sexual lives were further constrained by the religious teachings which reinforced the idea that sex should only be for procreation, not for personal fulfillment. Despite the overarching control exerted by the church and societal norms, there were still spaces where women found ways to challenge or subvert these expectations. The increasing presence of women in religious life, particularly in monastic communities, allowed for a certain level of intellectual and spiritual autonomy. Through their writings, teachings, and visions, women were able to redefine their relationships with their bodies and their sexuality. In doing so, they helped to create a more complex understanding of female sexuality, one that could exist outside of the strictly defined parameters set by the Church. However, as we've seen, these moments of agency were rare, and for most women, the pressure to conform to the expectations of marriage, chastity, and motherhood was overwhelming. Medieval society was structured in such a way that women's sexual identities were deeply tied to their roles as wives and mothers. Their understanding of sex was informed not by personal desire, but by duty and social function. The world of medieval women was one where personal pleasure was sidelined, and sexuality was seen as a means to an end. Whether that end was the survival of the family, the expansion of social status, or the fulfillment of religious obligation. Ultimately, medieval women's understanding of sex was shaped by an intricate network of religious teachings, societal norms, and economic realities. Though many women were taught to suppress their sexuality or direct it solely toward reproduction, there were still spaces where they could assert themselves. Whether through spiritual writings, small acts of defiance within marriage, or the subtle negotiation of sexual and reproductive roles, women in the medieval period were not passive victims of the sexual codes that constrained them. They found ways large and small to navigate a system that sought to define and control their bodies, ultimately proving that even within the confines of a repressive society, there were avenues for self-expression and autonomy. The complexities of medieval women's sexual education were not just shaped by religious doctrines, societal norms, and legal frameworks, but also by the deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about the nature of women themselves. These assumptions, which spanned everything from their inherent sexual purity to their moral strength, influenced the way women were taught to view their bodies and their sexuality. From early childhood, girls were raised to understand that their primary role in society was as wives and mothers, and their sexual lives were meant to serve these functions. As a result, much of what medieval women were taught about sex had little to do with personal autonomy or even mutual affection. It was about fulfilling duties that were seen as vital for the continuation of the family, the church, and society at large. The social expectations placed on women in medieval society were rooted in the idea that women's sexualities were inherently dangerous and needed to be controlled. This belief had its origins in ancient and medieval interpretations of the Bible, which often framed women's sexuality as a source of temptation and moral corruption. Eve, as the first woman, was often depicted as the one who led Adam into sin, reinforcing the notion that women's sexual desires were inherently dangerous. The teachings of the Church magnified this belief, teaching that women were weaker vessels, more susceptible to sin and temptation than men. This narrative shaped how medieval women viewed themselves and their bodies, teaching them to suppress their sexual desires or risk the wrath of God and society. The Church also played a significant role in defining the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior. As part of its teachings, the Church prohibited sex outside of marriage and even within marriage. It defined the purpose of sex as solely for procreation. Any pleasure derived from sexual activity was seen as an indulgence that could lead to sin. Women in particular were taught that their sexual desires should not be for their own satisfaction, but should be entirely focused on fulfilling the marital duty of producing heirs. This idea of procreation as the only legitimate purpose for sex dominated medieval sexual education, with little room for the understanding that sex might also serve emotional or personal needs. But despite the pervasive teachings of the Church, many women still found ways to challenge these restrictions, though often in subtle, covert ways. One example of this can be seen in the informal yet critical networks of knowledge that women created for themselves. In a world where formal education about sex was rare, women often learned about their bodies and reproductive health through the experiences and teachings of older women in their families or communities. Midwives, for instance, were often the only sources of practical real-world knowledge about sexual health and childbirth. In rural or lower-class communities, where access to formal medical knowledge was limited, women relied on midwives to guide them through the physical aspects of reproduction. These women were also sometimes privy to knowledge about fertility regulation, including herbal remedies that could be used to delay pregnancy or manage reproductive health. Though these women's knowledge was often disregarded by the medical establishment, it played a crucial role in empowering women with some degree of control over their sexual and reproductive lives. In a society where men and the Church dominated the formal discourse about sex, the knowledge shared by women became a subversive and vital form of resistance. This informal knowledge network allowed women to have some measure of control over their sexual health and fertility, even when they were not formally educated or allowed to speak openly about sex. In addition to these informal forms of knowledge, there were also instances where women, particularly those in positions of power, were able to leverage their sexuality in ways that defied societal expectations. For noble women, marriage was not only a personal matter, it was a strategic social and political tool. Marriage alliances were often used to secure political power, land, and wealth, and women were sometimes expected to fulfill these functions with little regard for personal desires. However, some women in the noble classes were able to assert their own agency within these structures. For instance, women like Eleanor of Aquitaine used their positions to wield significant political power even as they navigated the confines of marriage and sexual expectation. Eleanor, who was married first to the King of France and later to the King of England, had a series of influential relationships that were both political and romantic, which allowed her to exert influence over the affairs of state. Eleanor's story is emblematic of how some noble women found ways to express their sexual power in a world that sought to suppress it. By using their beauty, charm, and intellect, these women could create a space for themselves within a system that otherwise reduced them to mere reproductive vessels. Of course, these acts of sexual and political maneuvering were rare and often came at great personal cost. Noble women who stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior could face severe consequences, including public humiliation, divorce, or even excommunication. But even within this restrictive environment, women were still able to exert influence through their sexuality, even if this power was frequently indirect and hidden behind the layers of political intrigue. For most women, however, the realities of marriage and sex were far less glamorous. While noble women might have had the ability to navigate their sexual and marital lives with some degree of control, women in the lower classes were largely powerless in their relationships. For peasant women, marriage was often more of a financial necessity than an emotional or romantic endeavor. These women were expected to marry young, bear children quickly, and contribute to the household economy. Unlike their noble counterparts, lower-class women had little opportunity to negotiate the terms of their marriages or sexual relationships. The pressures of childbirth, economic survival, and family life left little room for personal exploration or emotional satisfaction. Despite the lack of autonomy and the overwhelming societal and religious pressure, women in medieval times found small ways to resist the boundaries placed upon them. Whether through informal networks of knowledge, the subtle manipulation of marriage and sexual expectations, or the use of religious mysticism to explore the boundaries of desire, medieval women were not entirely passive. Even in a world that sought to control their sexuality, many women found ways to assert themselves, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, but always in ways that reflected their humanity and complexity. As we continue to untangle the complex web of medieval women's sexual lives, it's essential to recognize that their experiences were not monolithic. The way women were taught about sex and sexuality was influenced by a multitude of factors, including their social class, geographic location, and individual circumstances. For some women, particularly those in higher social strata, there were subtle ways to assert sexual agency within a system that otherwise sought to control and constrain them. But for the vast majority of women, their sexual lives were defined by duty, fear, and conformity to societal expectations. This dynamic shaped their understanding of themselves as sexual beings, and left little room for exploration, pleasure, or personal choice. One of the most significant elements that shaped medieval women's sexual education was their relationship to their bodies. In medieval society, women's bodies were often seen through a dual lens, as a vessel for procreation and as a potential source of sin. The idea of the weak female body was prevalent in religious and medical teachings, which reinforced the idea that women were more susceptible to sexual temptation and emotional instability. As a result, women were taught to suppress or subdue their sexual desires, often internalizing the belief that their bodies were inherently sinful. This narrative left women with little room to view their bodies as a source of empowerment or autonomy. Instead, their bodies became the battleground on which moral and spiritual battles were fought. This concept of the female body as both powerful and dangerous was particularly evident in the way that sexuality was framed in religious teachings. The Church viewed women's sexual desires as inherently tied to sin and temptation. For example, the teachings of Augustine of Hippo, a prominent church father, linked women's sexuality to the fall of man, framing Eve's temptation of Adam as the ultimate act of moral corruption. This created a framework in which women were seen as the source of temptation and sin, and their sexual desires were viewed as inherently flawed. Women therefore had to be constantly vigilant, ensuring that their bodies did not succumb to their supposed natural inclinations. In this context, sexuality was not something to be celebrated or enjoyed. It was something to be controlled, feared, and regulated. Despite these teachings, there were moments when women's bodies and their sexuality became sources of power and influence. For noble women, particularly those who were able to leverage their social political power, their sexual identities could be more fluid, even if those moments were rare. Marriage was for them an arena where sexual agency could be subtly asserted. While marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons, women in these circles were sometimes able to influence their relationships, using their sexuality to form alliances, secure resources, or even protect their personal autonomy. The ability of some women to negotiate sexual relations within these frameworks, even when constrained by duty, suggests that there were moments where their sexual identities were more complex and less defined by mere submission to patriarchal norms. For women in lower social classes, the reality was far different. The sexual education of peasant women, for example, was largely defined by practicality. These women were taught about sex in the most basic terms as a means of ensuring reproduction and maintaining the household. In these communities, marriage was less about love or emotional connection and more about securing economic stability. The act of sex within marriage was viewed primarily as a means of bearing children and contributing to the family's labor force. For these women, their sexual lives were intrinsically tied to their ability to bear children, particularly sons who would grow up to assist in agricultural labor. The idea of sexual pleasure or personal desire was almost entirely absent from this framework. Instead, women were expected to endure the physical demands of childbirth and marriage, performing their duties with little expectation of fulfillment or satisfaction. Despite these stark realities, there were still small acts of resistance and autonomy within the confines of marriage and motherhood. For many women, the ability to control when and how they became pregnant was one of the few ways they could assert some agency over their sexual lives. While methods of birth control were rudimentary at best and often unreliable, women in rural areas relied on herbal remedies and other folk practices to manage their reproductive health. These methods passed down from one generation to the next allowed women to exercise some control over their fertility, even if it was shrouded in secrecy and fear. The fact that these practices existed and were passed down through informal networks of knowledge highlights the ways in which women, despite being denied formal education about sex, created their own systems of sexual agency. However, the suppression of women's sexual autonomy didn't end with marriage. The medieval church's teachings on virginity and chastity played a central role in defining the sexual lives of women, particularly in religious settings. For nuns, celibacy was not just a personal choice. It was a moral and spiritual obligation. Women who entered convents were expected to live lives completely free of sexual desire, and any deviation from this ideal was seen as sinful. Nuns were often portrayed as paragons of purity and devotion, with their sexuality repressed to the point of non-existence. But even within these religious communities, women were not entirely passive. Nuns often formed close bonds with one another, and their relationships, though non-sexual, were a source of emotional and spiritual intimacy. In some cases, these relationships may have mirrored the deep bonds of affection and desire that were otherwise unavailable to women outside of religious life. In these closed religious communities, women were sometimes able to carve out spaces for themselves, not only as spiritual beings, but as sexual beings in their own right. However, this space for self-expression was heavily restricted and framed by the Church's strict doctrines. Any expressions of sexuality that were not tied to religious devotion were seen as sinful, and women who defied these norms faced severe consequences. The fear of spiritual damnation, coupled with the intense pressure to remain sexually pure, meant that most women had little room to explore their own desires. In this context, sexual education was not about understanding one's body or desires. It was about suppressing and controlling those very impulses. Throughout the medieval period, the education of women about sex was shaped by a combination of religious doctrine, societal expectations, and economic necessity. For most women, this education was not comprehensive, and it offered little room for the exploration of their own desires or identities. Instead, it focused primarily on the idea that women's sexual lives were meant to serve the needs of their families and communities. Even so, there were moments of resistance, whether through the small acts of personal autonomy in marriage, the creation of knowledge about fertility and childbirth, or the subversion of the expectations placed on women in religious life. These moments, though often invisible or suppressed, reveal the ways in which medieval women found ways to navigate a deeply repressive system. In doing so, they managed to assert themselves, even in the smallest of ways, within a society that sought to limit their sexual agency. While much of the medieval period emphasized the control and regulation of women's sexuality, the persistence of female desire, both spiritual and physical, was ever present, even if often unspoken or sublimated into more socially acceptable forms. Women found themselves constantly negotiating the expectations placed upon them with their own inner desires. As we've seen, their sexuality was often regarded through lenses of duty, chastity, and procreation. Yet there were moments in medieval society where women, though operating within the boundaries of their roles, subtly or overtly asserted their own sexual agency. The ways women navigated the tensions between their desires, religious teachings, and social constraints are worth exploring, as these nuances reveal the complexities of female sexuality during the medieval period. One of the most intriguing and paradoxical spaces where medieval women expressed or explored their sexuality was through religious devotion. While the Church demanded sexual purity and chastity, it also held out the possibility of a different spiritually sanctioned form of desire, the union with God. Mystical experiences were a form of emotional and at times physical ecstasy, and women like Hildegard of Bingen and Teresa of Avila wrote at length about these encounters. Though these experiences were framed as spiritual rather than sexual, their intensity and imagery often blurred the lines between religious ecstasy and physical desire. These mystical experiences allowed women to feel a deep, intense connection to the divine, which they often described using language that could be interpreted as erotic or sensual. For these women, sexuality could be a sacred act. Though it was separated from the worldly and physical realms of sexuality that were heavily regulated by societal and religious structures. Hildegard of Bingen's writings, for example, discussed the power of the female body in both spiritual and symbolic terms, drawing on rich imagery of feminine strength and beauty. Although Hildegard was a nun, her mysticism presented a vision of female spirituality that acknowledged the fullness of womanhood, body, mind, and spirit. In her work, women's bodies were not merely sinful vessels to be controlled. They were also sites of spiritual power. While her theological works emphasized the virtues of chastity, Hildegard's integration of physical imagery within her spiritual visions suggested a more holistic understanding of female sexuality. This was a revolutionary concept for the time, as it subtly reframed the narrative of female bodies as being tied solely to sin, and instead allowed space for sacred expression through the physical form. However, such spiritualized forms of desire were an exception rather than the rule. For the vast majority of medieval women, the reality of sexual education was largely about navigating a world of rigidly defined roles that largely excluded sexual pleasure. The sexual education given to girls and young women rarely acknowledged their own desires or bodies beyond the functions required for marriage and motherhood. Sex was a duty, and any pleasure derived from it was viewed with suspicion or labeled as sinful. The practicalities of life, childbirth, maintaining a household and bearing heirs were prioritized over any consideration of women's sexual autonomy or fulfillment. This created a system in which women were often forced to deny their desires, conforming to a model that saw their worth primarily through their reproductive capacity. Yet, even within these restrictive environments, medieval women sometimes found ways to assert control over their bodies and their sexual lives. One such avenue was through midwifery and the passing of knowledge between generations of women. Midwives, who often operated outside the formal medical establishment, were invaluable sources of knowledge about fertility, childbirth, and reproductive health. Women who learned the craft of midwifery often developed a keen understanding of the body and its functions, which allowed them to exercise some degree of control over their reproductive lives. The midwife, as both a healer and a confidant, played a significant role in women's lives, providing essential knowledge about sex, conception, and childbirth, an area of expertise otherwise reserved for male-dominated religious and medical authorities. In this way, midwives became one of the few women who had some degree of agency when it came to reproductive health. And in rural communities, their influence over sexual knowledge was profound. In contrast, most women had little formal education about their sexual health or anatomy, and any deviation from the accepted sexual norms was not only ignored, but stigmatized. Women who sought to understand their bodies and their desires often found themselves branded as unnatural or immoral. The church and medical establishments perpetuated a narrative that linked women's sexual curiosity or non-reproductive sexual acts to moral decay. The concept of female hysteria was one manifestation of this, where any sign of a woman deviating from the prescribed norm of chastity and duty was interpreted as mental instability or emotional imbalance. This diagnosis was frequently used to explain everything from sexual desire to dissatisfaction in marriage, reinforcing the idea that women's sexual autonomy or pleasure was inherently abnormal or dangerous. The medical establishment, with its predominantly male doctors and religious leaders, also emphasized the idea that women's bodies were flawed and in need of control. And in many ways, this reinforced the notion that women could not be trusted with their own sexual knowledge. For medieval women, learning about sex, whether through personal experience, word of mouth, or the guidance of older women in their communities, was fraught with a social and moral risk. The idea that women could enjoy sex or that sexual knowledge might empower them was largely absent from the formal teachings of the time. This lack of recognition regarding women's sexuality left many women in a state of ignorance about their own desires, bodies, and sexual health. However, despite this ignorance, women did have access to small pockets of knowledge that allowed them to exercise some agency. For instance, while birth control methods were rudimentary and not always effective, women had access to folk remedies passed down through generations. These herbal remedies, often shared among women, allowed them to control their fertility to some extent, giving them a small measure of control over their sexual lives. The fact that women found ways to engage in these practices, even when officially condemned by the Church, speaks to the degree of resilience women showed in maintaining their sexual autonomy, even in the face of overwhelming societal and religious pressures. The silence surrounding medieval women's sexuality can make it difficult to fully understand the extent to which women navigated their sexual lives. But by looking closely at the practices and resistances embedded in their daily lives, it becomes clear that even within a deeply repressive system, women were not entirely passive. The few spaces where women could assert sexual agency through religious mysticism, Informal networks of reproductive knowledge or private resistance to marriage expectations highlight the subtle but significant ways in which medieval women shaped their own sexual identities. Even in a world that sought to control their sexuality, women found ways to carve out spaces for themselves and their desires. As we continue to explore the sexual education and experiences of medieval women, it becomes clear that their relationships with sex were not just shaped by theological and societal constraints, but also by the broader cultural shifts that were taking place during this period. The medieval era was marked by deep religious devotion, but it was also a time of significant intellectual and social change. These shifts, whether in art, literature, or philosophy, influenced how women perceived and navigated their roles in relation to sexuality, even if many of these changes happened outside the mainstream narratives that sought to control women's bodies. One such shift occurred in the realm of literature, where the portrayal of women and their sexuality was not always as repressive as the church would have liked. Literature, especially poetry and romance, often depicted women as powerful, desirable figures. In these texts, women were sometimes shown as the central agents of their sexual power, even if this was often wrapped up in unattainable ideals. For example, in the courtly love tradition, women were often placed on pedestals, idealized not only for their physical beauty, but also for their elusive and unattainable nature. These literary works emphasize the idea that a woman's sexuality could be something more than just reproductive duty. It could be the object of devotion, a source of mystery, and even a form of spiritual or emotional power. While courtly love was largely a romanticized fantasy, the depiction of women as figures of sexual desire was an acknowledgement of their potential to embody sexual power, even if that power was ultimately framed within the confines of male devotion and longing. In medieval romances, women often had the ability to inspire great feats of heroism and devotion. These stories reflected a cultural fascination with idealized female sexuality, one that transcended the utilitarian roles that women were expected to fill in real life. Though the idealized image of the woman as an unattainable figure was far from the reality that most women experienced, it created a cultural narrative that acknowledged women's sexual and emotional power, albeit in a highly stylized form. These portrayals were sometimes romantic, sometimes spiritual, but always marked by the idea that women were central to the world of desire, even if they were rarely depicted as active participants in their own sexual experiences. Yet, despite the poetic and romanticized portrayals of women in literature, the reality of medieval marriage and sexuality often left little room for genuine sexual autonomy or mutual affection. In practice, marriage was still largely a social and economic contract, where sexual relations were expected to produce children and maintain the family line. In these relationships, the power dynamics were heavily skewed in favor of men, and women's sexual agency was severely limited. The marital bed for many women was less about intimacy or affection and more about duty. While the courtly love tradition might have offered a kind of emotional release or romantic ideal, real life for most medieval women did not mirror this fantasy. Instead, their sexual lives were tied to procreation, to securing a family's future, and to fulfilling the expectations of both their husbands and society. The educational aspect of women's sexual lives was also profoundly shaped by these realities. Most women were not given any real education about their bodies, their desires, or their rights within marriage. The focus was overwhelmingly on the idea that women should remain virgins until marriage, then be chaste and obedient wives. Any hint of sexual exploration outside of this framework was not only frowned upon, but often criminalized. The idea of female pleasure outside the context of reproduction was almost entirely absent from formal education or societal discourse. If anything, sexual pleasure was linked with sin, and the female body in particular was viewed as something that needed to be controlled and concealed. The teachings of the Church, reinforced by the medical and legal establishments, taught women to fear their own desires and to view their sexuality as something to be suppressed for the greater good of their families and society. However, there were moments of resistance within the framework of medieval sexual education. Women, though taught to suppress their sexual desires, were also actively engaged in the reproduction of culture, both literally and figuratively through art, literature, and even family life. Women found ways to assert their identities, often subtly, within the structures that sought to define them. For example, the role of women in religious communities was one area where they could express themselves in ways that were often hidden from the public eye. Nuns, though bound by vows of chastity, often participated in intellectual and artistic endeavors that allowed them to navigate their relationship with their bodies and their spirituality. This offered women a chance to explore their inner lives and desires, even if that exploration was framed through the lens of religious devotion. These women wrote texts, created music, and painted works of art that reflected their experiences, emotions, and desires, some of which, though religious in context, could be read as explorations of the feminine, the sensual, and the deeply emotional. In some cases, nuns became the subject of mysticism. Their visions often portrayed in ways that could be interpreted as a form of spiritual ecstasy. These religious ecstasies were frequently depicted using language that blurred the lines between sexual and spiritual yearning, illustrating how the body, even within a framework of celibacy, could be a site of desire and longing. While such experiences were not openly sexual, they were often described in ways that mirrored the intensity of sexual emotion, revealing that women's sexuality was not something that could easily be separated from their spiritual or emotional lives. In these mystic traditions, the longing for God was presented in a way that mirrored earthly desire, suggesting that the connection between the body, sexuality, and spirituality was more complicated and nuanced than the rigid teachings of the Church allowed for. Despite the limitations on women's sexual education and expression, these examples show that there was room for a more complex understanding of female sexuality in medieval society, even if this understanding was often indirect or hidden. Through mysticism, literature, and the arts, women were able to assert their desires and identities, albeit in subtle ways that still conform to the broader structures of the time. The tension between repression and expression was ever present in medieval women's lives. And while they were often constrained by the expectations of marriage, motherhood, and religious devotion, many women still found ways to carve out spaces for themselves where they could express or explore their own sexuality, if not openly, then in ways that were more nuanced and layered. As we near the conclusion of this exploration into the medieval sexual education of women, it becomes apparent that the lives of medieval women were deeply shaped by both overt and subtle forms of control. The Church's teachings, the laws of the time, and the expectations placed on women as wives and mothers created a framework that overwhelmingly suppressed women's sexual autonomy. Yet even within this structure of repression, Women managed to navigate the complex terrain of their sexuality in diverse and sometimes unexpected ways. These moments of agency, though often hidden or subtle, reveal a resilience and complexity that is crucial to understanding the lived experiences of medieval women. One of the more significant ways in which medieval women were able to express their sexuality, even indirectly, was through the relationships they formed with other women. In a society where women were often taught to suppress their desires and keep them within the confines of marriage and reproduction, friendships and bonds between women became an important avenue for emotional and even sexual expression. Though these relationships were often framed within the context of chastity, the emotional intimacy and mutual care that women shared were vital aspects of their social lives. These relationships allowed women to explore their desires, form supportive networks, and in some cases resist the strictly enforced rules of sexual conduct imposed by men and the church. Nuns in particular lived in spaces that, though dominated by a religious authority, also allowed for some degree of sexual autonomy within a celibate framework. Within these communities, women often forged close and emotionally intense relationships with one another. While these relationships were intended to be platonic, the deep emotional bonds between nuns often mirrored the intensity of romantic and even sexual attachment. Some scholars have argued that the emotional language used by nuns to describe their spiritual relationships with each other mirrors the language of romantic love or even physical desire. Although these bonds were not overtly sexual, the language used to describe them of yearning, devotion, and longing often resembled expressions of romantic or erotic love, suggesting that even in highly controlled environments, the complexities of female sexuality could not be easily suppressed. This dynamic was particularly evident in the writings of mystics and religious figures like Hildegard of Bingen, whose work blurred the lines between spiritual and sexual desire. Hildegard's visions often included imagery that could be interpreted as intensely sensual, even though they were framed as expressions of divine union. These visions suggest that for some women, the spiritual and physical worlds were deeply intertwined, with sexual and emotional desires becoming vehicles for spiritual expression. This spiritualized form of sexuality allowed women like Hildegard to reclaim some measure of control over their bodies and desires, even while remaining within the confines of religious life. Through their mystical experiences, these women were able to challenge the dominant narrative that female sexuality was sinful or inherently linked to moral corruption. Outside the cloisters, the sexual education of medieval women was more often a matter of survival and social conformity than personal exploration or pleasure. For most women, sex was not about romance or personal fulfillment. It was about fulfilling societal roles. Marriage was the primary institution through which women's sexual lives were governed, and the Church's teachings on marriage framed it as a sacrament meant to produce children, especially male heirs. The idea that sex could be enjoyable or meaningful for its own sake was largely absent from the medieval understanding of sexuality, particularly for women. In fact, for women, any hint of sexual pleasure outside of the narrow confines of procreation was often seen as dangerous, sinful, or even mentally unstable. Yet, even within this environment of fear and repression, there were small acts of resistance. Women in lower social classes, for example, often had more direct control over their sexual lives, though this control was rooted in practicality rather than autonomy. Peasant women, for example, married young and were expected to bear children quickly, often out of economic necessity, However, in rural communities where the pressure to conform to the strictures of the church was less intense, women had more room to manage their sexual and reproductive lives. They passed down knowledge of fertility regulation, herbal remedies, and childbirth techniques through generations. This informal network of knowledge allowed women to exercise some control over their reproductive futures, even if they were not formally educated in these matters. The fact that this knowledge was shared in secret or passed from one woman to another reflects the deep necessity of maintaining some measure of autonomy in an otherwise restrictive society. In urban areas where the influence of the church and legal authorities was stronger, women's sexual lives were more tightly monitored. For women in these environments, any deviation from the prescribed sexual roles of wife and mother could lead to social ostracism or punishment. Adultery, for example, was a grave sin for women, often resulting in severe consequences such as public shaming, exile, or worse. However, even in these settings, women found ways to navigate the system. The existence of brothels and the tacit acceptance of extramarital affairs in some parts of society suggests that women's sexual behavior, though controlled, was not always completely suppressed. Some women, particularly those from lower social strata, found ways to assert their sexuality in ways that were not always aligned with the ideal of sexual purity set forth by the Church. Throughout the medieval period, women's sexuality was tightly bound to their social function. They were expected to marry, bear children, and contribute to the family's economic survival. Sex was viewed as an obligation, a duty to fulfill the social and religious requirements of marriage. For most women, their sexual lives were not about self-exploration or desire, but about performing their roles as wives, mothers, and daughters. But the underlying tension between societal expectations and women's sexual desires created a complex, multifaceted narrative. Women, though constrained by these roles, still found ways to express their sexuality, whether through subtle acts of defiance in marriage, through the spiritualized expressions of desire in religious life, or through the knowledge passed down in communities of women. These acts of resistance, though often small and hidden, reveal a rich tapestry of female sexual agency that cannot be overlooked in the history of medieval women. As we continue to peel back the layers of medieval women's sexual lives, it becomes increasingly evident that their experiences were not just defined by religious and societal control, but also by the subtle negotiations and adaptations they made within the frameworks they were given. The medieval period may have been one of repression, but it was also a time of resistance, resilience, and adaptation. Women didn't simply accept the sexual limitations imposed upon them. They adapted, found workarounds, and in some cases found small spaces where they could carve out autonomy or express their desires in ways that were more private, hidden, or even spiritualized. Understanding these moments of negotiation is crucial to recognizing the complexities of medieval women's sexual education. As these women, while constrained, were never entirely passive in the face of societal expectations in rural communities, where the influence of the church and the law were often less immediate. Women had more opportunities to assert some control over their sexual lives, especially in relation to reproduction. As we've already seen, women relied on knowledge passed down from older generations, especially through midwives and herbalists, to navigate their reproductive health. This knowledge wasn't just about managing pregnancies, but also about fertility, and in some cases the ability to delay or avoid pregnancy altogether. While the Church condemned such practices, viewing them as sinful or immoral, They persisted in secret as women found ways to navigate their sexual responsibilities on their own terms. These practices, though shrouded in secrecy, were acts of subtle resistance against the rigidly defined sexual roles imposed upon women. They allowed women to engage with their bodies and their sexuality in ways that were hidden from the official narratives of marriage, procreation, and purity. Yet the extent to which these practices were widespread is difficult to determine, largely because the social and religious structures in place at the time worked hard to suppress any discourse surrounding female sexual autonomy. Women's experiences, particularly those outside of the elite circles, were often left out of historical records, and the secrecy of reproductive knowledge further obscures a fuller understanding of their lives. Still, we can infer that women in these rural spaces, where the pressures of urban life and the church's authority were less pervasive, had more room to adapt and take charge of their sexual lives. It was in these spaces that women may have been able to exercise small acts of agency through controlling when and how they had children, forming close, supportive relationships with other women, or simply navigating the challenges of sex and reproduction as part of the survival of the family and community. In contrast, women in urban settings, particularly those of higher social status, were often subject to much stricter control over their sexual behavior. Marriages were more likely to be arranged for political, social, and economic reasons, and the expectations placed on these women were clear. They were meant to marry, produce heirs, and serve as the moral and sexual center of the family. In many ways, urban women's sexuality was more closely monitored, not just by their families, but also by the church and legal authorities. Adultery was a major sin, and any deviation from the ideal of sexual purity could lead to social or legal repercussions. Women who stepped outside the boundaries of socially acceptable sexual behavior could be ostracized or even punished. Yet, despite the harshness of these controls, there were still subtle ways that these women might have exercised control over their sexual lives, albeit less overtly. One way this occurred was through the negotiation of relationships within the institution of marriage. While most marriages were arranged, there were instances where women, particularly in the upper classes, might have had some say in the timing of when they had children or when to refrain from sex for reasons of health or personal agency. Noble women, despite being restricted by societal expectations, often had more freedom to navigate their personal lives, in part because their marriages were not just about family building, but also about creating political alliances. This gave some women the opportunity to leverage their sexual relationships to secure power, wealth, or influence. Though this was still within the narrow framework of what was considered acceptable. The subtle exercise of sexual agency, even in such a constrained environment, shows how medieval women found ways to navigate the rules imposed upon them. These small negotiations in marriage and family life, however, were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority of medieval women, their sexual lives were not about personal exploration, but about fulfilling roles as wives and mothers. Sex was a duty, often devoid of emotional connection or personal pleasure. Women were rarely taught to understand their bodies or desires in a way that acknowledged their humanity as sexual beings. Instead, sexual education for women revolved around their duties within marriage, and the concept of female sexual pleasure was almost entirely absent from the formal teachings. The idea that sex might be something women could enjoy for its own sake was viewed as dangerous, unholy, and potentially damaging to the moral order of society. However, even within these confines, women's sexual education was not solely about repression. It also had an economic and social function, particularly in relation to family life. For women in lower classes, where marriage was often about survival, sex and reproduction were directly tied to economic stability. Childbearing was seen as part of the labor force that ensured the continuation of the family's livelihood. Women's sexual lives were therefore not only defined by their marital duties, but also by their ability to produce children who could work the land, help in the household, and ensure the family's future. This connection between sex, reproduction, and economic necessity often overshadowed any potential for personal sexual autonomy. For many women, their worth was tied to their fertility and ability to produce heirs, and any deviation from this expectation was often met with harsh social judgment. In this context, the very concept of female sexuality became intertwined with survival, economic need, and social expectations. Yet, even within this framework, there were moments of resistance. Women in both rural and urban settings found ways to negotiate their roles within marriage and family life, subtly asserting themselves within the structures that sought to define them. Whether through the clandestine passing down of knowledge, subtle negotiations in marriage, or the occasional power dynamics between women and men, medieval women were not mere passive subjects of a repressive system. They were active participants in shaping their own sexual lives, even if those expressions were often hidden beneath the surface of the rigid social systems they lived under. As we reach the final stages of understanding medieval women's sexual education and the broader context of their sexual lives, it's essential to reflect on the way in which the period's cultural and societal norms influenced both the personal and collective experiences of women. The medieval period, with its deeply entrenched religious beliefs and hierarchical structures, was marked by the consistent effort to control and suppress women's sexuality. Yet despite this, the resilience and adaptability of women in navigating these constraints were undeniable. Women found ways to assert their agency not just in their sexual lives, but in shaping the broader cultural and spiritual conversations about their bodies and desires. One key area where this resilience is evident is in the role of women in religious communities, where they were both subject to and subtly able to challenge the traditional notions of female sexuality. Nuns, for example, despite living under strict vows of celibacy, found ways to express their spirituality and sexuality in ways that were deeply personal and often transcended the expected boundaries. The vows of chastity required by the Church were not just a denial of sexual activity, but also a way to distance women from the dominant narratives about their sexual and reproductive roles. However, within these religious communities, there were women who embraced their sexuality as part of their spiritual devotion, as seen in the mystical writings of women like Hildegard of Bingen. These women redefined the concept of desire, connecting their bodily desires to their deep spiritual connections and presenting a nuanced understanding of female sexuality that went beyond traditional suppression. In the mystical experiences of these women, the body became a site of spiritual ecstasy and divine connection, sometimes framed using the same language as sexual desire. Though this was still within the constraints of religious life, it illustrated a deeper understanding of the human need for connection, both divine and, by extension, human. This notion of erotic spirituality allowed some women to explore their desires within a safe and revered context, transforming sexual language into one of deep emotional and spiritual connection. By blending the sacred and the sensual, These women created new spaces for sexual expression, spaces that were allowed to exist within the walls of the church, albeit in highly controlled and spiritualized forms. However, the idea that women could only explore or express their sexuality within these highly restrictive contexts also highlights the degree to which the religious and social systems sought to control and define female sexual experience. While some women were able to navigate these systems in subtle ways, such as through the creation of spiritual ecstasy or deep emotional bonds with other women, for most, sexual life remained a matter of duty and compliance. Marriage as the only acceptable context for sexual activity was primarily viewed as a practical familial institution rather than a space for personal or sexual fulfillment. For women, the primary goal was to fulfill their reproductive roles, bearing children and providing heirs. In this light, sex became a mechanical process, a tool for social and familial survival with little room for personal pleasure or emotional connection. Yet even within this rigid framework, women's sexuality could not be fully contained. The ongoing emphasis on virginity, chastity, and sexual purity created a paradox for many women who were taught that their value lay in their ability to remain pure and untouched. Yet their bodies were also expected to serve the needs of their husbands and families, creating a tension between the idea of sexual purity and the reality of marital and reproductive duty. This tension was particularly evident in the experiences of noble women who, though often expected to remain virgins until marriage, were also expected to fulfill the role of obedient wives and mothers. These women were simultaneously revered for their purity and expected to be sexually available for the purpose of procreation, highlighting the complex dynamics of female sexuality in a period defined by the strict religious and social codes. For women of the lower classes, the pressures were different but no less intense. Marriage and childbearing were essential for survival, and sex was primarily viewed through the lens of economic necessity. In rural communities, where formal education about sex and reproductive health was almost non-existent, women learned about their bodies through the practical experiences of those around them. The transmission of reproductive knowledge, whether through midwives or older women, allowed for a degree of autonomy that was not available in more urban or aristocratic settings. This practical knowledge, though often stigmatized or viewed as folk wisdom by the authorities, allowed women to navigate their reproductive roles more effectively. Yet, the social expectation that women marry young and bear children quickly left little space for individual sexual exploration or desire. Despite these constraints, women's ability to subtly navigate their sexual lives is reflected in the many small but powerful acts of resistance that occurred within medieval society. Whether through maintaining close bonds with other women, using folk knowledge to manage fertility, or asserting small degrees of power within marriage, women were not simply passive recipients of societal and religious teachings. They found ways to reclaim their bodies and their sexualities, even if those acts of resistance were often hidden, fragmented, or coded. In this way, the very existence of these quiet rebellions is a testament to the agency women had in shaping their sexual lives within an oppressive system. The role of women in shaping the narrative of their sexual lives, despite being bound by the limitations of the time, is also evident in the literary works that came out of the medieval period. Though women were rarely the authors of these works, the depictions of women in medieval literature reflect a more complex view of female sexuality than the rigid framework suggested by the church or law. The courtly love tradition, while idealized and often unrealistic, still portrayed women as figures of desire and admiration. These works depicted women as powerful, even if their power was often framed through male devotion and longing. This idealized portrayal of female sexuality served as a counterpoint to the more restrictive, socially enforced understanding of women's bodies, offering a vision where women's sexuality was valued and celebrated, even if it was not fully realized in practice. And looking at the entire scope of medieval sexual education and the way it shaped women's experiences, it becomes clear that medieval women were not mere victims of a repressive system. Rather, they were active participants in the creation of their sexual identities, finding ways to express, navigate, and sometimes challenge the boundaries that society sought to impose. The rigidity of the medieval period did not completely extinguish the possibilities for female sexual autonomy. Though their sexual lives were often framed by duty, religious expectation, and social necessity, medieval women still found ways to assert control over their bodies, desires, and identities. Even if these acts were small or hidden from the mainstream historical record, through these acts of resistance, these women laid the groundwork for future generations who would in time push even further for a more open and inclusive understanding of female sexuality. As we reflect on the intricate tapestry of medieval women's sexual education and their lived experiences, it's important to note that the period was not just a time of repression, but also one of intense transformation. The medieval period, particularly in the later centuries, was a time of cultural, intellectual, and even legal shifts that, although slow and often imperceptible, began to challenge and question the rigid frameworks that sought to control women's sexuality. These shifts didn't bring immediate liberation for women, but they laid the groundwork for the gradual change in the way female sexuality was understood and eventually approached. As the medieval world moved into the Renaissance, there was a growing intellectual and cultural curiosity about the body, desire, and the role of women, setting the stage for future shifts in sexual education and gender roles. One of the most important areas of transformation during the later medieval period was in the rise of universities and intellectual centers, which began to influence how people, particularly the educated, thought about sex and gender. While the majority of women still had little access to formal education, the increasing prominence of universities in medieval Europe began to question, at least indirectly, some of the assumptions about gender, sexuality, and the body. The intellectual climate of the late medieval period began to shift away from the purely religious teachings that had dominated sexual discourse, and instead embraced a more humanistic approach, one that included both the body and the spirit. Scholars began to reconsider classical texts, rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman philosophies that offered different views on the role of women and the purpose of sex. These ideas, however, slowly began to challenge the long-standing view that female sexuality was inherently sinful or dangerous. While much of this intellectual change was still dominated by male scholars, there were women who became part of these intellectual circles. The rise of women like Christine de Pizan in the late medieval period marks one of the first times women began to speak publicly and explicitly about gender, sexuality, and social roles. Christine de Pizan in her works, notably in the Book of the City of Ladies, critiqued the prevailing misogynistic attitudes of the time and suggested a more balanced view of women. Her ideas were not explicitly about sexual liberation, but they began to question the essentialist ideas that tied women's worth solely to their reproductive roles and sexual purity. Pizzon's works contributed to a broader intellectual movement that over time would influence later feminist thought. In addition to these intellectual developments, we also see the beginnings of legal changes that would impact the sexual education and autonomy of women. In some areas, especially in cities with more advanced legal systems, there was a slow but noticeable shift in attitudes towards women's rights within marriage and divorce. While most women still had limited legal rights in marriage and family law, some regions began to allow for more flexibility in divorce laws, and there were discussions, albeit limited, about women's sexual rights within marriage. Although the majority of medieval women still lived under strict patriarchal systems, the seeds of legal reforms, particularly those that would come in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, began to take root in the later medieval period. Yet, despite these early intellectual and legal changes, the reality for most medieval women remained defined by strict social and religious norms. For the vast majority, sex was still primarily about reproduction, and women were taught that their bodies existed to fulfill the needs of their husbands, families, and the church. This role was cemented in the sexual education they received, which emphasized chastity, virginity, and obedience as virtues above all else. Women were not given the tools to understand their bodies or sexual desires beyond the functions required for procreation. This lack of education, both practical and emotional, left many women unaware of their own sexual rights or potential for pleasure, leaving them to navigate their desires in secrecy or silence. For women in the lower classes, where education and social mobility were limited, sexual education remained an unspoken part of life. These women had to rely on informal channels of knowledge, passing down wisdom through generations of women who understood the basics of fertility, childbirth, and contraception. For these women, sex was often a practical matter, intertwined with the demands of family and labor. In rural communities, where religious and social pressures were less intense than in the cities, women had more space to manage their sexual lives in ways that were functional rather than emotional. However, their experiences were still deeply influenced by the social and economic structures of medieval life, which continued to view their bodies primarily through the lens of reproductive utility. Despite the heavy restrictions placed on their lives, women found ways to challenge, resist, and adapt to the sexual norms of the medieval period. Whether through the subversive use of reproductive knowledge, subtle acts of negotiation within marriage, or the creation of spiritualized forms of sexual expression in religious life, women's sexual lives were far more complex than the rigid framework suggested by the church, legal systems, and societal expectations. These moments of resistance, however small, illustrate the ways in which medieval women navigated the constraints placed upon them. And in doing so, they began to lay the groundwork for future shifts in the way women's sexuality would be understood. As we look back on the sexual education of medieval women, it is clear that while much of it was grounded in fear, control, and duty, there were also glimmers of autonomy, intellectual rebellion, and emotional depth. Though the majority of women's sexual education was centered on chastity and obedience, the moments where women managed to carve out spaces of resistance, expression, or understanding are crucial to recognizing their agency. These women, though often confined by the systems around them, proved that even in the most repressive of times, the desire for autonomy, intimacy, and self-expression could not be entirely suppressed. Their lives, though largely shaped by societal expectations, also reflected the deep and often hidden currents of resilience that would eventually give way to broader social and cultural changes. As we reach the final exploration of medieval women's sexual education and experiences, it's important to reflect on the broader implications of these narratives. The sexual lives of women in the medieval period were not just shaped by the institutions of the church, the law, and societal pressures. They were also influenced by the evolving cultural and intellectual currents of the time. The slow shifts in thinking, particularly those that began in the late medieval period, would set the stage for more significant changes in women's sexual autonomy in the centuries that followed. These early changes, though subtle and often hidden beneath the surface of rigid systems, represent a critical turning point in the trajectory of women's sexual rights and education. In the late medieval period, with the rise of universities and intellectual discourse, there was an increasing challenge to the long-standing religious and cultural narratives that sought to define and control women's sexuality. Intellectual movements began to embrace more humanistic perspectives, including a focus on the body, individual desire, and the nature of sexual relationships. Although these intellectual shifts were often slow and met with resistance, they mark the beginning of a broader cultural reevaluation of the place of women within society, particularly with regard to their sexual roles. Classical texts which had largely been dismissed or ignored during earlier periods were revisited during this time. These texts, many of which came from ancient Greece and Rome, presented different views on sexuality, marriage, and women's roles that contrasted sharply with the prevailing Christian narrative. For example, ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Plato had differing views on the role of women in relationships and family, which, while still deeply patriarchal by modern standards, offered a more complex and diverse framework for understanding female sexuality than the medieval teachings allowed. While these intellectual shifts were predominantly confined to the male-dominated academic world, they had a ripple effect. As more women began to gain access to education, albeit still limited, they could contribute to these ongoing conversations about gender, sexuality, and the role of the body. Figures like Christine de Pizan, already discussed for her critical writings, began to push against the idea that women's worth was tied solely to their roles as wives and mothers. Pizan's works, though grounded in the context of the medieval worldview, began to challenge the rigid and repressive sexual education that women had been given for centuries. She argued for the dignity of women and their right to intellectual and personal autonomy, which extended into the realm of sexual agency. Although Pizan did not advocate for sexual liberation in the modern sense, her work reflected the beginning of a shift in how women's sexual lives were viewed, moving from the purely reproductive and dutiful roles they had been confined to toward a more nuanced understanding of women as complete autonomous individuals. Moreover, as cities and trade grew during this period, there were small but significant changes in the way women engaged with their sexual identities. The rise of urban centers created more opportunities for women to exercise a degree of independence, particularly for those involved in trade or other economic activities. While this shift did not necessarily lead to widespread social or sexual liberation, it created pockets of opportunity for women to define their own sexual and personal lives within the confines of marriage and motherhood. Women's roles within the family continued to be critical. But in some urban areas, women found more flexibility in how they managed their sexual and marital relationships. This is especially evident in the way that women in merchant classes or trades could leverage their economic independence to negotiate different terms in marriage and sexual relations, at least to a certain extent. Though the legal system and church still defined the boundaries, The economic and social shifts of the time made it slightly easier for women to exercise some influence over their sexual lives. Yet for the vast majority of women, these shifts were slow, and their sexual lives were still primarily defined by the reproductive expectations of society. Marriage continued to be the only socially acceptable outlet for sex, and it was still largely centered around procreation with very little room for personal or emotional fulfillment. This was particularly true for lower-class women whose sexual lives were entangled with the realities of work, survival, and family labor. For many, marriage was a financial necessity, and sex was often about fulfilling familial obligations. Women's sexual desires and needs were secondary to the need for children and the labor they could provide, ensuring the survival of the family unit. This utilitarian view of sex continued to define the sexual education and experience of most women, as their roles as wives and mothers were prioritized above any consideration of personal pleasure or sexual autonomy. However, even in this restrictive environment, women did manage to find moments of resistance and autonomy. The development of folk knowledge, especially regarding fertility control and reproductive health, was one of the most significant forms of sexual agency that women exercised. Women in rural areas or lower social classes where access to formal education was limited had to rely on the knowledge passed down from one generation of women to the next. Midwives, herbalists, and older women in the community became the de facto sources of knowledge about women's bodies. And many of these women had a deep understanding of fertility, childbirth, and even in methods of contraception. These informal networks of knowledge allowed women to navigate their sexual lives with some degree of control, even if this control was not always acknowledged by the church or legal systems. What is especially important to recognize is that these small acts of resistance were not isolated to rural areas or lower classes. The rise of literature, particularly among the nobility, provided a cultural space for women to express and understand their sexuality in ways that weren't solely tied to reproduction. In works of poetry, romance, and chivalric literature, women were often depicted as objects of desire, but also as powerful figures who could inspire devotion, longing, and sometimes rebellion. These representations allowed women, especially those in the upper classes, to imagine their sexualities in more complex ways. Ways that, while idealized and distant from the reality of their daily lives, suggested that women's sexual identities could be more than mere vessels for procreation. Looking back on the sexual education of medieval women, it's clear that while many aspects of their sexual lives were dominated by duty, repression, and control, there were subtle ways in which women asserted their agency. Whether through the clandestine transmission of reproductive knowledge, the spiritualized expressions of sexuality in religious life, or the idealized portrayals of female sexual power in literature, medieval women were not just passive victims of their time. Instead, they found ways to navigate the constraints placed upon them, carving out moments of personal autonomy, expression, and desire. These moments, though often hidden beneath the surface of history, laid the groundwork for the shifts in understanding women's sexuality that would come in later periods. While much of the medieval period was about silence, repression, and conformity, the acts of defiance, both large and small, reflect the deep human drive for autonomy, intimacy, and connection, forces that could never be fully suppressed, even by the most oppressive systems. As we move toward a broader reflection on the legacy of medieval women's sexual education and their lived experiences, it is crucial to recognize the long-term implications of the medieval framework. The narratives of control, repression, and survival that defined the medieval sexual lives of women would not simply disappear with the end of the period. Instead, the lessons learned, or rather the lessons that were forced upon women, would have lasting consequences, contributing to the shaping of sexual norms and gender roles for centuries to come. The medieval understanding of female sexuality set the foundation for how women would later be taught about their bodies and desires in influencing both the intellectual and cultural shifts of the Renaissance and beyond. The medieval period's repressive attitudes toward female sexuality were in many ways deeply ingrained into the broader cultural and religious fabric. In many parts of Europe, the fear of female sexual desire persisted well into the modern era. Women were expected to conform to strict codes of behavior defined by the religious morality and societal norms. The association of female sexuality with sin, temptation, and moral corruption was so entrenched that it continued to shape attitudes toward women and their sexual autonomy long after the medieval period. It was not until later periods such as the Enlightenment and the rise of modern feminism that many of these ideas began to be seriously challenged. One of the most significant legacies of medieval sexual education for women was the idea that women's bodies were inherently linked to their moral worth. In medieval times, a woman's value was often judged by her ability to maintain her virginity until marriage and her faithfulness afterward. This narrative of sexual purity, one that defined a woman by her ability to remain untouched and morally untainted, would continue to haunt women's sexual identities well into the 19th and 20th centuries. The moral weight placed on virginity and sexual restraint meant that women were often denied the opportunity to explore or even understand their own sexual desires. It created a system in which women's sexualities were defined by the needs of others, husbands, families, and society, rather than by their own needs or desires. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, the intellectual climate shifted, and the humanist movement began to question the long-standing religious and philosophical assumptions about women and their bodies. However, even as new intellectual movements sought to free women from some of the rigid moral codes that had dominated their sexual education, many of the medieval ideas about female sexuality persisted. The focus on sexual purity, the view of women's sexuality as inherently dangerous, and the association of female desire with sin all remained influential even as society began to embrace new ways of thinking about gender and sexuality. The legacy of the medieval period continued to define how women were viewed within the broader cultural and religious context, influencing the sexual education of women for generations. Yet, despite the long-lasting impact of medieval sexual education, women in the Renaissance and beyond began to push against the constraints placed upon them. The slow but steady rise of feminist movements beginning in the 18th century and gaining momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries marked a shift toward greater sexual autonomy and personal freedom for women. These movements, which advocated for women's rights, education, work, and equality, challenged the long-standing narratives that had defined women by their reproductive roles and their moral worth. Through these movements, women began to reclaim their sexual identities, viewing sexuality not as a burden or a duty, but as an integral part of their humanity. In this way, the medieval period, with its deeply entrenched religious teachings and the societal pressures, can be seen as the starting point for many of the conversations and battles over women's sexual rights that would come in later centuries. While women in the medieval period were limited in their ability to assert sexual autonomy, Their quiet acts of resistance laid the groundwork for the broader movements that would eventually challenge and redefine the sexual norms of Western society. These movements would continue to push for the recognition of women's sexual rights and desires, seeking to dismantle the long-standing association between women's bodies and moral purity, and instead embrace a more holistic and empowered view of women's sexuality. Furthermore, the medieval experience shaped how women's bodies were viewed, not just by society, but by medical and legal authorities as well. The idea that women's bodies were inherently weak, morally corrupt, or even inherently sinful persisted well into the 18th and 19th centuries, contributing to the medicalization of women's sexuality. The so-called scientific explanations of female sexuality which emerged during the Enlightenment often still reflected medieval assumptions about women's supposed sexual dangers. These ideas, though seemingly more rational or progressive, still perpetuated the view that women were the weaker sex whose desires had to be controlled for their own moral and physical well-being. The medical and legal systems that developed over the centuries were not free from the deep-rooted ideas about female sexuality that had been entrenched during the medieval period. The battle for women's sexual rights and autonomy would continue into the modern era with significant victories coming in the 20th century, with the rise of feminist movements, sexual liberation, and greater acceptance of reproductive rights. The feminist movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries thus sought not only to secure women's rights to education, voting, and property, but also to challenge the deeply ingrained assumptions about women's sexuality. These movements worked to dismantle the notion that women's worth was tied to their ability to remain sexually pure, and instead advocated for a vision of sexual freedom that included consent, pleasure, and bodily autonomy. As we look back on the history of women's sexual education, particularly in the medieval period, we see a pattern of repression and resistance. Though women in medieval Europe were often subjected to the strictest social and religious codes, they managed to find ways to navigate these rules, express their desires, and assert their agency in quiet yet powerful ways. From the mysticism of religious women to the informal networks of knowledge shared between mothers, daughters, and midwives, women in medieval society were far from passive. Even in a world that sought to control and suppress their sexual lives, they found ways to challenge the system, carve out moments of autonomy, and contribute to a broader, though still emerging conversation about sexual freedom and identity. As we reflect on the broader legacy of medieval women's sexual education, we must acknowledge that their struggles and subtle resistances laid an important foundation for the future development of sexual autonomy and women's rights. The lessons that medieval women learned about their bodies, sexual roles, and desires were not erased after the Middle Ages ended. Instead, they were carried into the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and beyond, integral to the larger historical narrative of how women's bodies and sexualities would be shaped over time. Even though the medieval period was characterized by repression and rigid control, it also provided the early groundwork for the eventual rise of feminist movements and the broader sexual liberation movements that would challenge centuries of cultural and religious repression. One of the most striking aspects of medieval sexual education was the pervasive idea that women's sexuality needed to be tightly controlled and defined. The religious and social norms of the time placed significant emphasis on women's sexual purity, associating their worth directly with their ability to remain virgins before marriage and faithful to their husbands afterward. These deeply ingrained ideas permeated medieval society, creating an environment where women's sexual desires were either denied or framed as morally suspect. But as we've seen, the system was not entirely foolproof. Women still found ways to subtly resist, assert agency, and carve out spaces of autonomy within the confines of these harsh societal structures. Perhaps one of the most important ways in which medieval women pushed back against these constraints was through religious life. For nuns, who were expected to live lives of chastity, their sexuality was often spiritualized or sublimated into a form of intense devotion. While nuns were bound by vows of celibacy, many found ways to experience and express desire within the confines of their religious devotion. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who experienced intense visions often described with erotic language, show how women could reframe their sexual identities within a framework that was spiritually sanctioned. These mystics were able to connect their sexual desires to their deep emotional and spiritual needs, creating a new language of spirituality that blurred the lines between sexual and divine longing. Although the Church itself sought to suppress such expressions, these women redefined sexuality, offering an alternative narrative where desire was not inherently sinful, but could be a source of spiritual power and connection. Even though these religious expressions were rare and often closely monitored, they suggested that medieval women could still experience a kind of autonomy over their sexual lives, even in a highly controlled environment. Outside of the convents, however, the reality for most women was starkly different. For peasants and women in the lower classes, sex was largely about duty, reproduction, and fulfilling social and familial expectations. The idea of personal sexual enjoyment was foreign to many, as women's sexual education primarily revolved around the mechanics of reproduction and the management of familial responsibilities. Marriage for these women was often a matter of survival rather than choice, and sex was a tool for ensuring the continuation of the family line and labor force. Yet even within this rigid context, some women still found ways to manage their reproductive lives in ways that weren't entirely defined by their societal expectations. The knowledge shared informally between women about fertility control, childbearing, and even contraception, despite its legal and religious implications, was an act of resistance and autonomy. The existence of these informal networks of knowledge and shared experiences suggests that even in a society that actively worked to suppress women's sexual agency, there were small but significant spaces where women could navigate their sexual and reproductive lives with a measure of control. This is particularly true in rural communities where access to formal education was limited and where women relied on older generations to pass down wisdom about managing pregnancies, fertility, and sexual health. These women, often midwives or healers, were pivotal in ensuring that other women had the information and tools to take control of their sexual lives, even in an environment that frequently silenced or dismissed women's sexual desires. As society evolved into the Renaissance, these informal networks of knowledge and the intellectual challenges of medieval norms began to play a more significant role in shaping the future of women's sexual autonomy. Though much of the intellectual and cultural change in the Renaissance was still dominated by men, the rediscovery of classical texts and the humanist movement began to question long-held assumptions about women's roles in marriage, sexuality, and family life. For the first time in centuries, ideas about human sexuality were starting to shift, and women's roles in these discussions were beginning to change. These early seeds of change, though still slow and often deeply constrained by the patriarchal systems that governed society, contributed to the larger transformation of sexual and gender norms in the centuries that followed. The intellectual movements of the Renaissance, which challenged traditional religious ideas and embraced more humanistic perspectives on sexuality, marked the beginning of a cultural shift that would eventually lead to the broader sexual liberation movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. While women in the medieval period were still largely constrained by the same repressive religious and societal systems that had defined their sexual education, the ideas that would fuel feminist thought and the sexual liberation movements were already taking root. Medieval women's quiet acts of resistance, whether through spiritual expressions of sexuality, the transmission of reproductive knowledge, or the subtle negotiation of sexual roles within marriage, formed the foundation for the eventual challenge to the sexual norms that had defined women's lives for centuries. In the long view, the sexual education of medieval women was not simply a story of repression, but one of resilience, adaptation, and quiet rebellion. Even as religious institutions and societal norms sought to silence women's sexual voices, women found ways to express their desires and assert their agency. The medieval period may have been marked by limitations and constraints, but it also set the stage for the conversations about sexual autonomy, agency, and freedom that would later dominate in the modern era. The small acts of resistance, the informal networks of knowledge, and the intellectual shifts of the time all contributed to a broader rethinking of women's sexuality, a rethinking that would only continue to evolve in the centuries to come. As we conclude our journey through the medieval sexual education of women, we must recognize the enduring legacy of the period. Despite the repression and control exerted over medieval women's sexual lives, the quiet resistance, subtle acts of agency, and shifting cultural currents we have explored laid the groundwork for future changes in how women would understand and experience their bodies, their sexuality, and their desires. The medieval period may have been characterized by rigid social and religious norms that sought to control female sexuality. But within these constraints, women still found ways to assert their identities and navigate the complex web of duty, desire, and repression that defined their lives. The legacy of medieval women's sexual education is not only found in the intellectual and cultural changes of the Renaissance, but also in the legal and social shifts that would take place over the following centuries. As we have seen, women's sexuality was often framed within the context of duty to family, marriage, and society, rather than pleasure or personal agency. This framework, which cast women's bodies as vehicles for reproduction rather than sources of desire or autonomy, would persist for centuries. Yet the resistance women exhibited through spiritual ecstasy, knowledge sharing, even the subversive use of sexual and reproductive knowledge paved the way for the later reimagination of women's sexual autonomy in more open and progressive ways. While the medieval period may have been harsh in its regulation of women's bodies, it also highlighted the deep human need for connection, intimacy, and agency. Even within a system that imposed rigid constraints, medieval women found ways to live their sexual lives with a degree of autonomy. This autonomy, though limited and often expressed in hidden or subtle ways, was a form of resistance against the overarching social and religious structures that sought to control their sexuality. These small acts of resistance, whether it was through the quiet sharing of knowledge, the reclamation of spiritualized desire, or even the personal negotiations within marriage, are testament to women's resilience. Over time, The intellectual shifts of the Renaissance and Enlightenment would begin to challenge the medieval understanding of women's sexuality. As women gained access to education, social mobility, and the right to participate in public discourse, they began to demand a different kind of sexual education, one that acknowledged their desires, their autonomy, and their full humanity. The feminist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries would push back against the restrictive sexual norms that had dominated women's lives for so long, demanding not only equal rights, but also sexual liberation. These movements would continue to gain momentum through the 20th century and beyond, and eventually contributing to a broader cultural and social redefinition of gender, sexuality, and autonomy. However, the influence of medieval sexual education was not entirely erased. Even as society moved toward greater sexual freedom and women's rights, the echoes of medieval teachings about female sexuality continued to influence public attitudes and societal norms. The association between female sexuality and sin, the emphasis on women's reproductive roles, and the marginalization of female desire persisted well into the modern era. The legacy of medieval repression still shaped how women's sexuality was understood, how it was regulated, and how it was expressed, albeit more subtly and less overtly. It would take centuries of struggle and resistance before women's sexual autonomy was truly recognized and respected in the way it is today. Yet the medieval period offers an essential reminder that the process of change is never linear. The fight for sexual liberation, autonomy, and gender equality is built upon the actions, decisions, and resistances of those who came before. The women who lived in the medieval period, though often constrained by the norms of their time, provided the foundation upon which future generations would stand. By challenging the boundaries of what was possible within their social and religious context, these women unknowingly paved the way for the broader societal changes that would redefine sexual freedom in the centuries to come. In understanding the sexual lives of medieval women, we see a multifaceted history of repression, resistance, and resilience. The control over their bodies may have been vast and overwhelming, but the quiet rebellions through spiritual practices, shared knowledge, or negotiations within marriage reveal a deeper narrative of women's agency. This agency was subtle, often hidden from the historical record, but it was a constant thread woven throughout the medieval period. It was through these small acts of resistance that women began to assert their sexual identities, even if those assertions were not fully recognized in their time. As we turn our gaze to the future, we are reminded that the history of women's sexual education is ongoing, constantly evolving as societal, legal, and cultural norms shift. The struggle for sexual autonomy, for the right to express one's sexual desires without fear or shame, is not over. The legacy of medieval women's sexual lives, though shaped by repression, provides both a cautionary tale and a wellspring of inspiration for the ongoing fight for gender equality, bodily autonomy, and sexual freedom. These women who navigated a world that sought to control their sexuality left behind a powerful legacy that continues to inspire those who seek to dismantle the barriers that restrict sexual autonomy today.